The last unicorn has a restraining order against me. A cozy fantasy rom-com with magical mishaps, emotional shields, and a unicorn WHO knits out of spite. By Win Valentine. Copyright 2025 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities, is entirely coincidental. Win Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco.
1. Glitter hoof and glitter bombs. Sely pressed her back to the gnarled oak, holding her breath as sunlight speared through the canopy of Briarwild Glade. Dawn mist curled around her ankles, and the forest breathed with ancient magic that made her skin tingle. She peered around the trunk, following the silver thread of hair caught on a bramble bush ahead. "There you are," she whispered, excitement bubbling up inside her like a shaken potion. A tiny shower of golden sparkles escaped her fingertips and drifted to the ground. Where they landed, violets and bluebells burst into sudden bloom, weeks before their time. Sely winced, shoving her hands into her pockets. Sorry, she muttered to the bewildered flowers. "Timing's a bit off, isn't it? But you look lovely." The trail continued ahead, tiny perfect hoofprints pressed into moss so green it almost hurt to look at. Sely had been tracking these signs for 3 days, sleeping in trees and eating berries that sometimes made her ears steam. Worth it. All of it worth it if the rumors were true. She slipped off her boots, tying the laces together and slinging them around her neck. The forest floor felt cool and alive beneath her bare feet. Better for sneaking, anyway. The last thing she needed was to scare off another subject. The ministry was still sending her glitter bomb howlers about the mermaid incident. Sely crept forward, ducking under low-hanging branches dripping with morning dew. The trees thinned, and there it was, a misty pond with water so clear it mirrored the sky perfectly. And drinking at its edge, impossibly beautiful and impossibly real. The last unicorn. Sely's heart stuttered. Glitterhoof, as locals had named the creature, stood with one slender leg bent at the knee, drinking delicately from the pond. Its coat was purest white, dappled with silver that caught the light like scattered stars. Its mane hung in wild tangles, twined with leaves and what looked suspiciously like bits of wool. The spiral horn rose from its forehead like a twisted moonbeam. "Oh, sweet merciful magic," Sely whispered, fumbling for her notebook. Her hands shook as she sketched protective runes across a blank page. Confirmed sighting of Equus Magicae Stellarum. Approximately 7 hands tall, distinctive silver dappling pattern. She was so focused on capturing every detail that she didn't notice the ink smudging across her cheek as she pushed her curls back from her face. The unicorn lifted its head slightly, water droplets catching on its muzzle like crystals. "You're perfect," Sely breathed, adding a final flourish to her sketch, a protective circle designed to shield the creature from detection spells. 7 years they've been hunting you, and here you are, drinking from a pond like it's nothing. Like you're not literally the most important magical creature discovery of the decade." The unicorn's ears flicked. Sely froze, but the creature returned to drinking. Taking a careful step forward, Sely's bare foot came down on a twig. The snap echoed through the glade with unnatural volume, as though the forest itself was alerting all its inhabitants. The unicorn's head jerked up. Eyes like ancient galaxies, swirling with stars and impossible depth, narrowed and locked directly on Sely's hiding spot. For a heartbeat, neither moved. I'm here to help, Sely called out, abandoning stealth and stumbling forward with her hands raised. Her notebook tumbled to the ground, pages flipping open. I'm Celie Rosehill, Junior Associate Creature Liaison. Well, self-appointed, but the paperwork's being processed. Technically, I'm on a probationary watch list for magical field incidents, but only the minor kind. Mostly. Depends who you ask. Glitterhoof backed away, hooves light on the moss. A faint glow of irritation emanated from its body, casting the clearing in a pearly light. The Magical Preservation Society thinks you're extinct, Sely rambled, taking another step forward. But 3 people in Willowfin Village said they saw you last moon turning, and there's been reports of enchanted knitting appearing on doorsteps, and I just thought, you're in danger, you know? The Collectors Guild has a bounty on unicorn horn that would buy a small kingdom, and they don't ask questions about how it's obtained, and I have this protection program all drawn up. She paused for breath, pulling a crumpled scroll from her satchel. See? 37-point comprehensive protection plan. With optional relocation to the southern sanctuaries, where the ley lines would mask your magical signature, and? Glitterhoof's expression grew increasingly sardonic, if such a thing was possible on equine features. It surveyed Sely with the weary disinterest of an immortal being confronted with yet another eager human. I know you can understand me, Sely said, softer now. And I know you've been avoiding people. Smart, obviously. But the Collectors Guild has new tracking spells. Dark stuff. I can help. I'm really very good with magical creatures when they're not, running away from me. The unicorn turned, presenting its elegant hindquarters to Sely. It began walking away with deliberate slowness. Wait, panic rose in Sely's chest. If Glitterhoof disappeared into the deeper forest, she might never find it again. The unicorn would be vulnerable, alone. Her hands dove into her satchel, pushing aside emergency snacks, a collapsible tent, 3 mismatched socks, and a jar of ever-burning fireflies. Her fingers closed around a piece of parchment. She yanked it out, a summoning circle she'd been developing for weeks, designed to create a temporary bond of trust and communication between magical beings. This won't hurt, I promise, she called, dropping to her knees and smoothing the parchment on the forest floor. The circle was intricate, runes and symbols flowing in elegant patterns. Emergency Creature Compassion Protocol. My own invention. Sely pricked her finger with a silver pin from her hair, and let a single drop of blood fall onto the center of the circle. Please work, please work, please work, she whispered as she activated the spell with a pulse of magic. The circle should have glowed a calm, reassuring blue. Instead, it flared bright neon pink, the color so vivid it hurt her eyes. The runes shifted, rearranging themselves like irritated ants. That's not right, was all Sely managed before magical backlash sent her tumbling backward into a patch of luminescent mushrooms. They exploded on impact, releasing clouds of glowing spores that attached themselves to every inch of her hair and clothes. Glitter blasted. Sely sputtered, spitting out spores that tasted like sugared violets. She sat up, now resembling a human constellation. A distinctive bureaucratic pop sounded above her head. An official-looking scroll materialized in midair, complete with gold tassels and a wax seal bearing the insignia of the Magical Regulation Department. It unfurled with theatrical slowness, revealing bold letters that flashed red and gold. Summon Emergency Escort, Magical Hazard Containment. No, no, no. Sely leapt to her feet, trying to snatch the scroll. It floated just beyond her reach, bobbing tauntingly higher whenever her fingers brushed its edges. That's not what I meant to summon. To her surprise, Glitterhoof hadn't fled the magical mishap. Instead, the unicorn approached with unexpected interest, its spiral horn beginning to glow with inner light. It stretched its neck, and delicately touched the tip of its horn to the scroll. The parchment shuddered as though caught in a breeze. A second document extruded from its bottom edge, unfurling with a sound like disapproving throat clearing. This new edition bore the title Magical Restraining Order, Creature Harassment, in severe black lettering. The air filled with the scent of cinnamon, and what could only be described as disappointed paperwork. That's just rude, Sely protested, brushing spores from her sleeve. I wasn't harassing you. I was trying to help. There's a very clear difference in magical law regarding intent and... Her words died as a shimmering tether of magic, like gossamer spun from moonlight, formed between her left wrist and Glitterhoof's front leg. The unicorn stared at it, then at Sely with profound annoyance. That's not supposed to happen, Sely murmured, trying to dispel the tether with frantic hand gestures. There must have been a magical collision, she whispered, eyes darting between the tether and the restraining order scroll. Like trying to cast a shielding charm while a banishment rune is still active. Oh stars, I just crosswired bureaucracy. Each movement only produced more sparkles that drifted through the air and settled on nearby plants, causing them to grow tiny, confused flowers out of season. This was supposed to be a consent-based communication spell, not a binding. Glitterhoof snorted and stamped a hoof. The ground beneath it frosted over slightly. From the corner of her eye, Sely noticed movement near the clearing's edge. She turned just in time to see her discarded boots shudder once, twice, and then spring upright as though inhabited by invisible feet. Wait, what? Sely stared in disbelief as her favorite boots, soft leather with mismatched patches where she'd repaired them with whatever material she had on hand, began to hop away into the underbrush. That spell wasn't supposed to animate footwear, she muttered. Or maybe it's Glitterhoof's idea of a warning. Wait. I need those, she called, lunging toward them, but the magical tether yanked her back when Glitterhoof refused to move. The boots disappeared with a mischievous rustle of leaves. Glitterhoof made a sound suspiciously like a snicker. Was that necessary? Sely demanded, gesturing at the vanishing footwear. Do you have any idea how far I've walked tracking you? My feet are going to be shredded. The unicorn merely blinked its galactic eyes. Then, without warning, a ball of silvery yarn and knitting needles materialized in the air before it. With movements too deft to follow, Glitterhoof began knitting something small and tight-stitched, the needles clicking together with aggressive precision. Are you stress knitting now? Sely asked, incredulous. Before she could get an answer, the official scroll gave a commanding tug. It strained toward the east, pulling Sely along with it regardless of her protests. The tether between her and Glitterhoof stretched tight, forcing the unicorn to follow or be dragged. Sorry. I'm sorry. Sely called back as she stumbled over roots and rocks. The scroll hovered a foot above the ground, leading them through the forest with the determination of an enchanted bureaucrat late for a meeting. Oh no, Sely moaned. It's auto-routing. Emergency escort dispatch is randomized based on proximity and magical severity. Please let it not be. She tried to keep her bare feet from the worst of the forest floor, but soon twigs and pebbles were leaving scratches and indentations on her soles. Glitterhoof followed at a distance that kept the tether taut, alternating between glaring at Sely and returning to its knitting project, which was beginning to look suspiciously like a tiny, angry sock. The scroll led them through a part of the forest Sely didn't recognize, thicker, older trees with faces that seemed to watch as they passed. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, they emerged into a small clearing containing a sturdy wooden structure. A ranger outpost. Not just any ranger outpost, but one bearing the silver oak insignia of the elite magical forest wardens, the most serious by-the-book magical law enforcement in the realm. The scroll accelerated, dragging Sely the final few yards before attaching itself to the door with a resounding thwack. It began to glow with increasing brightness, sending out magical pulses that clearly signaled high-risk arcane hazard present. Sely stood before the door, disheveled beyond salvaging. Her curls formed a wild halo around her face, interspersed with luminescent mushroom spores that made her look like a walking night sky. Her clothes were rumpled and torn in places from the hasty journey through the forest. Dirt and scratches covered her bare feet. Ink still smudged one cheek. She attempted to smooth her hair, succeeding only in dislodging more glowing spores, which floated around her like tiny falling stars. Behind her, Glitterhoof let out what could only be described as a resigned sigh. Sely straightened her shoulders and plastered on her most winning smile, the one she reserved for moments of catastrophic magical mishap. "I can fix this," she whispered to herself as footsteps approached from inside the outpost. Glitterhoof rolled its galaxy eyes. The magical tether between them pulsed once, as if laughing. The scroll's glow intensified to near blinding, highlighting Sely in a spotlight of magical regulatory judgment as the door began to open.
2. Clipboard cloaks and compliance warnings. Ashen Ward's clipboard vibrated against his desk with such intensity that his meticulous arrangement of confiscated runic tablets shifted 3 millimeters to the left. He paused, eyes narrowed at the disruption to his sorting system. 7 years as a ranger, and he'd developed a precise methodology for categorizing illegal enchantments, alphabetical by class, subcategorized by potential magical discharge rate, with color-coded tabs for tracking chain reaction possibilities. The clipboard freed itself from the desk, hovering at eye level with aggressive purpose. Red light pulsed from its surface as bold letters materialized. Priority alert, magical hazard, Briarwild perimeter. Ashen suppressed a groan. 3 hours into organizing the contraband seizure from last week's midnight market raid, and now this. He glanced longingly at the half-sorted pile of enchanted trinkets. The Category 4 sleep charms were still mixed with the Category 2 dream manipulators. "Acknowledged," he said curtly. The clipboard bobbed once in response. He rose from his desk, automatically straightening his deep green ranger uniform with practiced efficiency. The regulation handbook required immediate response to perimeter alerts, regardless of ongoing administrative tasks. He pulled his enchanted compass from his belt pouch and flipped open the tarnished silver case. The needle spun wildly before snapping toward the outpost entrance with unnerving certainty. A soft patter against the roof announced the arrival of rain. Ranger regulations officially classified unexpected precipitation during alarm response as unfortunate timing Class 2, which required additional documentation regarding weather-induced complications. The administrative burden alone was enough to deepen Ashen's already substantial frown. The compass continued its insistent pointing as Ashen approached the weathered oak door of the outpost. His gaze caught on a glowing scroll that definitely hadn't been attached to the doorframe 20 minutes ago. He plucked it from its magical moorings, the enchanted parchment unfurling itself with officious crispness. Magical violation, notice. Subject, Celie Rosehill. Location, Briarwild Glade, Sector 14. Infractions. Unauthorized summoning, Grade 3. Creature harassment, Endangered Species Subset. Illegal rune configuration, Uncertified Practitioner. Pattern disruption of ley alignment. Barefoot forest trespassing, Section 12, Paragraph 7. Excessive magical resonance without dampers. Ashen's eyebrows inched incrementally higher with each listed violation. He'd seen plenty of magical mishaps in his tenure: herb gatherers triggering ancient ward systems, amateur spellcasters accidentally animating underbrush, the occasional tourist feeding restricted metamorphic berries to woodland creatures. But barefoot trespassing? That particular regulation hadn't been enforced since the thorny enchantment crisis of 38. Bracing himself for whatever chaos awaited, Ashen pushed open the door. The sight that greeted him required several seconds of professional processing. Standing in the steadily increasing rain was a woman who appeared to have been dunked in a vat of bioluminescent spores. Her dark curls were plastered to her head, dripping a mixture of rainwater and what appeared to be glimmering pollen onto her already soaked shoulders. She was indeed barefoot. But it was her companion that caused Ashen's carefully maintained expression to falter. A unicorn. An actual unicorn, approximately 14 hands high with a coat that seemed to absorb and reflect the raindrops in equal measure. Its horns spiraled upward in crystalline perfection, and its eyes held the kind of ancient disdain that made Ashen's most judgmental looks seem welcoming by comparison. In his entire career, Ashen had documented exactly 2 unicorn sightings, both at considerable distance. To have one standing on his doorstep was the kind of incident that usually required an emergency debrief, 3 signed affidavits, and a 3-month suspension if handled incorrectly. A unicorn at this proximity? The Magical Conservation Department probably had a specific protocol just for this exact scenario, and Ashen was almost positive he'd skipped that chapter, and appearing to be knitting something with quick, aggressive movements of its shimmering horn was professionally significant enough to warrant a special incident form. Possibly 2. His gaze catalogued details with practiced efficiency. The woman's clothes were singed at the edges, suggesting spell backfire. The unicorn's left flank bore the faint shimmer of a magical binding. The ground between them was scorched in a perfect circle, indicative of a protection barrier having been forcefully established. "I'm Celie Rosehill, Magical Creature Liaison," the woman announced with inexplicable cheerfulness, as though being detained by magical rangers was a delightful networking opportunity. She extended a hand smeared with what appeared to be crushed pink crystals and glitter. "I can explain everything." Ashen stared at the offered hand without taking it. Instead, he reached to his utility belt, where a second clipboard materialized at his touch. The woman, Sely, remained undeterred, her smile brightening despite the rain now cascading down her face. "That's Glitterhoof," she added, nodding toward the unicorn, who responded by knitting more furiously. "We've had a slight miscommunication." "Miss Rosehill," Ashen began, his voice as dry as the pages of the regulation manuals he'd memorized, "I count 6 distinct violations of magical code in a Class 1 restricted area. Slight is not the qualifier I would select." His clipboard began methodically listing each violation, complete with corresponding regulation numbers and penalty assessments. The rain intensified as Ashen detailed the infractions, but he continued with unwavering focus. Bureaucratic precision waited for no weather. "Let me clarify a few things," Sely interrupted, seemingly unfazed by the growing list of magical crimes attributed to her. "First, the summoning was more of an invitation, very polite, I even used please. Second, I wasn't harassing Glitterhoof, I was apologizing for the state of the northern migratory routes. Have you seen the trash those potion harvesters leave behind?" The clipboard trembled indignantly, adding interruption of official violation listing to its growing manifest. "As for the barefoot thing," she continued, wiggling her mudcake toes, "that was tactical. Unicorns appreciate authenticity. Shoes mask your true aura signature." The unicorn paused its knitting to give her what could only be described as a withering side-eye. "That is not supported by any approved research on magical creature interaction," Ashen responded, watching as his clipboard added 3 more infractions to the list. The device seemed personally offended by her explanations. "Now," Ashen continued, "regarding the magical restraining order." "The what?" Cely's eyes widened. Ashen gestured to the faint shimmering thread connecting her to the unicorn. "Creature Protection Statute 37B, the unicorn has filed a formal magical complaint requesting enforced distance." Ashen eyed the shimmering tether warily. The restraining order clearly hadn't processed before the magical contract kicked in. Typical bureaucratic overlap, 2 opposing enchantments now stuck in conflict, and he was the unfortunate hinge point. "File the," Sely spluttered, turning to Glitterhoof with genuine betrayal in her expression. "We were having a perfectly civil conversation. I only tried to brush your mane a little." The unicorn resumed knitting with what appeared to be renewed spite. "Regardless," Ashen continued, "the magical binding is now in effect and—" His warning came too late. Sely had already pulled a small vial from her pocket and was muttering what sounded like an improvised counter-charm while sprinkling its contents in the space between herself and the unicorn. "No, unauthorized," Ashen began, but was interrupted by a small explosion of pink sparks that briefly illuminated the entire clearing. The outpost lights flickered ominously, and through the door, Ashen could see his perfectly aligned pencils roll off his desk and scatter across the floor. His jaw tightened visibly. "Magic," he finished flatly. Sely blinked through the lingering sparks, looking sheepish for the first time. "I may have miscalculated the nullification ratio." "Miss Rosehill." Ashen's voice had taken on the special tone he reserved for particularly difficult cases, calm, controlled, and carrying the faint promise of extensive paperwork. I am detaining you under Magical Compliance Bureau Guidelines, Section 47B, Magical Hazard Containment. He pulled a worn stamp from his belt and firmly pressed it against the violation scroll. The stamp glowed upon contact, its impression expanding into an intricate web of magical script that rapidly formed a shimmering contract. The contract rose from the parchment and expanded outward, encircling both Ashen and Sely in a dome of faintly luminescent text. Standard procedure, Ashen explained. Until the violations are addressed or serviced, you remain in Ranger Cust. The contract suddenly constricted with a sound like snapping elastic, pulling Ashen and Sely at least 3 feet closer together than professional protocols dictated as appropriate. Ashen immediately attempted to step back, only to feel a distinct magical resistance, as though they were tethered together by invisible bungee cords. The unicorn made a sound suspiciously like a snort. Ashen's primary clipboard, ever vigilant, added proximity enchantment, active to its display. What just happened? Sely asked, attempting to move away and finding herself equally restricted. With growing apprehension, Ashen consulted the binding regulations that materialized from his utility belt, a thick codex with emergency protocols, hazard containment embossed on the spine in severe lettering. As he flipped through the densely printed pages, his expression shifted from professional detachment to unmistakable dismay. According to regulation, he said slowly, the level of magical instability you've demonstrated, combined with the presence of an endangered magical creature and the activation of multiple protection wards, has triggered Protocol 94C. This was the kind of magical entanglement that usually required immediate containment protocols, a senior enchanter, and possibly a memory wipe for everyone involved. Instead, it was just him. Which means? Sely prompted. Which means, Ashen continued, I am required to maintain protective proximity until all magical charges are addressed and the endangered creature is secured in an appropriate conservation zone. You're babysitting me. A smile tugged at the corner of Sely's mouth. I am performing hazard containment, Ashen corrected with dignity. And escort duties. He continued scanning the regulations, his frown deepening. According to the unicorn's filed petition, the only accredited conservation zone it will accept is... He stopped, reread the line and stared accusingly at Glitterhoof. The unicorn continued knitting, radiating smug satisfaction. The Cradle of Echoes, Ashen finished. Oh, I've always wanted to go there. Sely's entire demeanor brightened. It's supposed to have the highest concentration of unaltered magical flora in the entire. It's a 7-day journey through notoriously unstable magical territory, Ashen interjected. And according to this binding, he gestured to the shimmering contract still hovering between them, I am now required to escort both you and the unicorn there. Well, that doesn't sound so bad, Sely offered. Ashen fixed her with a look that had sent hardened poachers fleeing. The contract also specifies that we cannot be separated by more than approximately 10 feet until the journey is complete. Ah. Sely's smile faltered slightly. That's cozy. It's highly irregular, Ashen muttered, flipping through additional protocol handbooks that appeared and disappeared as he referenced them. While he consulted the seemingly endless regulations, Sely wandered as far as the magical tether would allow, which brought her just inside the outpost door. She bent down to pick up one of his fallen pencils, absently tucking it behind her ear while examining the magical contract that now connected them. Ashen noticed with alarm that the pencil began to glow faintly in her presence, its simple graphite core reacting to whatever chaotic magical field she naturally emitted. His clipboard flickered next, the glowing runes briefly rearranging themselves into what looked like a unicorn wearing sunglasses. He slapped the side of it. Stop that. The screen blinked twice, then resumed normal formatting, though the incident severity bar now pulsed in glittering gradients of pink and orange. This was worse than he'd initially calculated. Not only was she triggering existing enchantments, but she was inadvertently activating mundane objects. "Please don't touch anything else," he said, closing the last handbook with a snap. "We depart at first light. Until then, you'll remain in a containment space." "You mean a cell?" Her eyebrows rose. "I mean a regulation temporary detainment space," he corrected, leading her further into the outpost. The unicorn, bound by its own connection to Sely, was forced to follow, looking thoroughly displeased about being indoors. The spare room was austere but adequate: a simple cot, a wash basin, and a small desk with a flickering magical lamp. Ashen removed a thick book from the shelf near the door and handed it to Sely. "Magical Compliance, a comprehensive guide to not triggering catastrophic arcane incidents," she read aloud, weighing the substantial tome in her hands. "Read this. Memorize it," Ashen instructed flatly. Sely flipped to a random page and read, Chapter 47, Why Barefoot Incantations Lead to Fungal Infestations and Property Damage. Fascinating bedtime reading. "Protocol requires me to be within proximity, but not in the same room," Ashen explained, pointedly ignoring her commentary. "I'll be right outside. Do not attempt any magic. Do not attempt to remove the binding. Do not have any fun whatsoever," Sely suggested. "Create additional violations," he finished. As he turned to leave, movement from the unicorn caught his eye. Glitterhoof had completed whatever project had occupied its knitting efforts. The unicorn levitated a small wool figure with its horn, casually depositing it on the desk. Ashen stared at what was unmistakably a tiny effigy of himself, complete with ranger uniform and a permanent scowl. He closed the door with perhaps more force than strictly necessary, the sound echoing through the outpost like the final punctuation on a very long, very complicated regulatory citation. Settling himself in the chair directly outside her door, the maximum distance the binding would allow, Ashen pulled out his report forms and began the extensive documentation that tonight's incident required. His once perfectly ordered existence had been derailed indefinitely, replaced by what promised to be a uniquely trying escort assignment. Worse still, his pencils remained scattered across the floor of his office, their careful organization destroyed. The Ranger Handbook didn't cover this level of disruption. He would simply have to write his own protocols.
3. You can't bribe a unicorn with fruit snacks. Sely sat cross-legged on a mossy log, drawing absent-minded circles in the mud with a twig as she watched Glitterhoof work. The unicorn's horn created intricate patterns in the air, delicate runes that solidified into a transparent barrier around him. Each movement was precise and deliberate, the magic flowing like liquid silver from his horn. The rain had finally stopped, leaving everything smelling wonderfully earthy and alive. Normally, this would have cheered her immensely. Unfortunately, it was hard to maintain optimum cheerfulness when a mythical creature was actively creating magical fortifications, specifically to keep you away. "You know," she called out, leaning forward, "this feels a bit excessive." Glitterhoof didn't respond, just traced another rune that blazed bright before settling into the shimmering wall. A pulsing sign materialized across the front. "Keep back," in sparkling letters that occasionally rearranged themselves to read, "This means you, Sely." "I was only trying to help," she muttered, breaking her twig into tiny pieces. "Not like I knew the braided harmony charm would trigger a restraining order." The unicorn finally looked up, galaxy eyes narrowing in a way that clearly communicated, "And yet, here we are." 20 feet away, Ashen Ward was setting up his regulation tent with military precision. Each stake went in at exactly the same angle, rope tension matched perfectly on all sides. His forest green ranger gear remained mysteriously unsullied by mud, while Sely's yellow tunic had already accumulated an impressive collection of stains. She watched as he placed enchanted stones in a perfect circle around his campsite, each one glowing faintly blue as it activated. When he finished, he consulted his ever-present clipboard, which hovered at shoulder height like a judgmental companion. Curious, Sely stood and wandered toward his impeccable campsite. The moment her foot crossed the invisible boundary, the stones buzzed sharply, a sound like angry bees that made her jump back. "What in the actual sparkles?" she yelped. Without looking up from his clipboard, Ashen said, "The proximity spell requires us to remain within range, not in each other's pockets." "These are repellent stones," she accused, nudging one with her bare toe and wincing at the resulting buzz. "You're warding me off like I'm some kind of pest." He finally looked up, his storm gray eyes betraying nothing. The Magical Compliance Bureau Handbook, Section 4.9, Paragraph 3. Maintain appropriate distance from hazardous magical entities when bivouacking in unsecured territory. "I'm not a hazardous magical entity," Sely protested, then paused. "Well, not on purpose, anyway." The corner of his mouth twitched, so slightly she almost missed it. "Tell that to my incident report. 3 pages, single-spaced." "I bet you used unnecessarily small handwriting too," she muttered, retreating to her own pathetic excuse for a shelter, a simple tarp strung between 2 trees. Compared to Ashen's regulation tent, with its waterproofing charms and thermal regulation, her setup looked like something a child would build for a backyard adventure. She rummaged through her satchel, pulling out an assortment of colorful treats. Crystallized honey sticks wrapped in waxed paper, lavender-infused sugar cubes that emitted a calming scent, and her prized possession, a handful of sparkleberries that pulsed with their own inner light. With careful precision, she arranged them in a perfect semicircle at the edge of Glitterhoof's barrier. "Peace offerings," she announced cheerfully, gesturing to the spread. "The honey sticks are from Mistress Briar's special hives in the Southern Hollows. And these sparkleberries? I traded a very nice enchanted hair comb for them at the solstice market." Glitterhoof flicked his tail dismissively and turned his attention to, was that knitting? The unicorn was indeed manipulating shimmering thread with magic, creating what appeared to be a surprisingly complex hat. The needles clicked rhythmically, as he pointedly ignored both her and her offerings. "Fine," she sighed dramatically. "But they'll be here when you're ready." Ashen shouldered his ranger pack and adjusted his utility belt. "I'm patrolling the perimeter," he announced, his clipboard obediently hovering at his shoulder. "Don't touch anything. Don't summon anything. Don't enchant anything." "What about breathing? Is breathing allowed?" Sely asked sweetly. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Just stay put." The moment Ashen disappeared into the trees, his footsteps fading into silence, Sely slid off her log and crept closer to Glitterhoof's barrier. She glanced over her shoulder, confirming the ranger was truly gone, then pressed her palm against the shimmering wall. "I really am sorry about the whole restraining order thing," she whispered. "I just wanted to help protect you from poachers. There've been rumors about collectors hunting the last unicorn, and I thought—" The barrier rippled at her touch, sending a jolt of static through her entire body. Her curls instantly stood on end, crackling with leftover magical energy. She looked like she'd been struck by a miniature lightning bolt. The sting on her skin faded quickly. The one in her chest lingered. She wasn't used to magical creatures really rejecting her. Not like this. Usually, even the crankiest Kelpie warmed up by day 2. Glitterhoof looked up, galaxy eyes narrowing, and deliberately turned his back to her. Sely's shoulders slumped. Usually, magical creatures at least appreciated her intentions, even when her execution went sideways. But the unicorn's rejection stung more than the static shock. Still, she wasn't one to stay dejected for long. She brightened, reaching for a stick. "I'll just leave these here for when you change your mind," she said, carefully pushing the treats under the barrier with the stick. The honey sticks went first, followed by the sugar cubes, and finally, the sparkleberries, which pulsed a bit more frantically as they crossed the magical threshold. She stood, dusting off her hands on her already filthy tunic, and turned to assess her sad little camp. Maybe she could gather some ferns to make a softer sleeping pallet, or some moss to plug the leaky corner of her tarp. A subtle glow reflected off the tree trunks. Sely wheeled around to see Glitterhoof's horn illuminated with silvery light. Before she could react, a whoosh of air made her duck. Her backpack, which she'd left beside the log, suddenly inflated like a balloon, contents spilling out in a chaotic jumble as it rose skyward. "No, no, no," she cried, lunging for it, but the pack was already sailing upward, lodging itself firmly in the branches of a towering silverleaf tree. Her spare clothes, maps, and enchanted compass dangled just out of reach, swaying in the gentle breeze like festive decorations. She glared at the unicorn, who had returned to his knitting with a suspiciously innocent expression. "I deserve that," Celie admitted, nodding sagely. She studied the tree trunk, which was smooth and straight with no low branches. Nevertheless, she attempted to shimmy up it, wrapping her arms and legs around it and inching upward. She made it approximately 3 feet before sliding back down. "Okay, new approach," she muttered, backing up for a running start. This attempt ended with her sliding down even faster, landing with an undignified splash in a puddle of muddy rainwater. The wet splash drew Glitterhoof's attention. He watched in silence, horn dimmed, expression unreadable. For a split second, Celie thought she saw hesitation, almost like he wanted to help. Then it was gone, buried under that usual unicorn-level disdain. For just a heartbeat, the unicorn's expression softened, a flicker of something that might have been amusement or even concern. But it quickly hardened back to disdain, and he returned to his knitting with renewed intensity. By the time night fell, Celie had exhausted every possible tree-climbing strategy, including a brief attempt to fashion a grappling hook from her hairpins and belt. Her hair now hung in damp ringlets around her face, her clothes were sodden, and without her pack she had no blanket for the increasingly cold night. She huddled under her tarp, shivering as frost began forming on the ground around her. The temperature was dropping rapidly, a common phenomenon in magical forests, where weather often responded to the emotional state of the creatures dwelling within. Given Glitterhoof's current mood, they might wake up buried in snow. Across the clearing, Ashen's regulation tent emanated a soft, warm glow. Waves of heat visibly rippled from it, making the air shimmer invitingly. He'd returned from patrol hours ago, made himself a neat little dinner from his rations, and disappeared inside without so much as offering her a spare sock. Celie's teeth chattered. "Jay just need socks," she whispered to herself, eyeing the buzzing perimeter stones with calculation. "Just some dry socks." She pushed herself to her feet, wincing at her numb toes. Casting a furtive glance toward Glitterhoof's barrier, from which gentle snoring now emanated, she crept toward Ashen's tent. The proximity stones buzzed in warning as she crossed their boundary, but they didn't actually stop her, just announced her transgression to anyone listening. She hesitated outside the entrance, conscience having a brief but spirited debate with her frozen extremities. Extremities 1. She carefully parted the flap and peered inside. The tent's interior was, unsurprisingly, a testament to obsessive organization. Labeled containers lined one wall, supplies arranged by both function and color. A small enchanted heater in the center cast the warm glow she'd observed from outside, radiating blessed heat that made her nearly whimper with longing. Ashen himself wasn't there, likely performing another perimeter check or communing with whatever forest spirits approved of clipboards and regulations. She tiptoed inside, quickly locating a compartment marked Regulation Textiles Footwear in precise handwriting. Just as she reached for it, droplets of water from her still damp clothes dripped onto a spread of maps laid out beside the heater. The droplets glowed on contact, bright emerald green against the parchment. Celie froze, watching in horror as hidden leyline markings began to activate, intricate patterns that were clearly never meant to be triggered by random dripping. "No, no, no," she whispered, frantically trying to blot the drops with her sleeve, which only made things worse. The maps began to pulse with intensifying emerald light, the patterns spreading like veins across the parchment. She snatched a pair of thick wool socks from the container and backed away, but it was too late. The light shot through the tent walls, piercing the fabric like emerald lightning and streaking into the forest. The beams formed a perfect geometric pattern, some kind of magical signal or beacon. Within moments, a low humming sound grew from the underbrush. Celie squinted into the darkness beyond the tent flap, and saw tiny points of blue light emerging from beneath leaves and around tree trunks, dozens of them, multiplying rapidly. Beetle-sized sprites with translucent blue wings rose from the forest floor, drawn to the magical signal like moths to a flame. They streamed toward the camp, their combined light forming a constellation that illuminated the clearing in eerie blue-green. "I can fix this," Sely yelped, clutching the stolen socks to her chest as she bolted from the tent. The first wave of sprites swirled around her head, their wings humming at a pitch that made her ears ring. She batted at them ineffectually as she sprinted barefoot through the mud. Glitterhoof emerged from his barrier, awakened by the commotion. The unicorn's eyes widened at the swarm of sprites now circling the camp like a living whirlpool of light. At the same moment, Ashen returned from wherever he'd been, his expression moving from confusion to comprehension to outrage in the span of 3 seconds. "Are those ley-activated field sprites?" he barked, already reaching for a countercharm. "Those haven't been seen since the thornroot bloom collapse." His voice cracked slightly, just enough to betray that even he wasn't entirely calm. "What did you do?" he shouted over the humming, ducking as sprites dive-bombed his head. "Nothing. Just borrowing socks," Sely called back, waving the incriminating evidence. Glitterhoof stomped his front hoof against the ground, creating a ripple of silver light that expanded outward like a shockwave. The sprites scattered momentarily, their flight patterns disrupted by the magical pulse. In the brief flash of silver light, Sely caught Ashen's expression, a mixture of disbelief and resignation that suggested he was mentally composing an additional incident report, possibly in an even smaller font. The moment of reprieve didn't last. The sprites regrouped, now agitated by Glitterhoof's interference. They swarmed more aggressively, some diving toward the maps still glowing inside the tent, others circling Sely like she was the center of their universe. She spun in circles, trying to swat them away, only to discover something new on her head, a weight that hadn't been there before. Reaching up, her fingers encountered soft, knitted fabric. She glanced toward the unicorn. He didn't meet her eyes, but the twitch of his tail and the suspicious glimmer on his horn said enough. He'd aimed it. Probably. Somehow, in the chaos, Glitterhoof's newly completed hat had found its way onto her head. It fit perfectly, which was probably the most bewildering part of this entire situation. "I'm sorry," she yelled to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone. The sprites followed her movements precisely, maintaining their orbit around her as she zigzagged across the clearing. "I just wanted socks. Dry feet are a basic human right." Glitterhoof nickered, a sound that might have been a laugh if unicorns did such things, and retreated back within his barrier, which sparkled more intensely as the sprites attempted to breach it. Ashen, meanwhile, had retrieved his clipboard and was frantically flipping through pages, presumably searching for the regulation response to swarm of sprites triggered by unauthorized sock theft. Sely clutched the socks to her chest like precious cargo. Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, she couldn't help but feel a tiny bubble of something like joy rising within her. This was ridiculous. This was a disaster. But the night air was filled with light and magic, and somehow she'd earned both a unicorn's hat and a ranger's socks. Not bad for her first day of being a high-risk arcane hazard.
4. Field notes and firelight. Ashen knelt at the edge of their campsite, methodically repairing the ward perimeter damaged in last night's sprite invasion. His fingers traced precise magical patterns that glowed briefly before sinking into the ground. The early morning air was crisp with frost, and his breath formed small clouds as he muttered regulation incantations under his breath. Section 42, Subsection 3, Perimeter Restoration following Class C Magical Incursion, he murmured, feeling the familiar tingle of protective magic flow through his fingertips into the soil. The damaged ward stones had been scattered across 12 feet of forest floor, exactly what the manual warned about sprite swarms. Predictable chaos. Manageable chaos. Unlike his current assignment. His clipboard hovered nearby, scrolling through damage reports while occasionally emitting disapproving beeps when Ashen's readings deviated from standard parameters. He adjusted his technique slightly, and the clipboard responded with a satisfied ping. "Yes, thank you for your input," Ashen muttered. The enchanted clipboard vibrated slightly, as if affronted. After 8 years, he still hadn't figured out if the thing actually understood him or simply responded to tone. Glitterhoof watched from a distance, having expanded his barrier overnight to include a small pond where he now stood, purposefully splashing water with his front hooves. Ashen caught the unicorn's eye briefly, another silent standoff of mutual annoyance. The creature deliberately turned away and kicked more water into the air, creating a miniature rainbow that spelled out, "Go away," in the morning light. Ashen felt Celie's approach before he saw her. The proximity spell tingled along his forearm when she crossed the 20-foot boundary. He deliberately didn't look up as her bare feet, still no shoes despite the borrowed socks, came into view, toes wiggling in the frosted grass. "Good morning." Her voice was far too cheerful for someone who'd spent the night sleeping on pine needles after destroying half their supplies. "Those are pretty patterns. Very geometric." Ashen continued his work, hoping silence might discourage conversation. It never had before, but hope was technically free. "So what exactly do rangers do besides frown at people who rescue unicorns?" Sely asked, squatting beside him and poking curiously at a ward stone. The stone flashed red in warning. Ashen gently but firmly moved her hand away, noting the unicorn's rescue description but choosing not to correct it. There was no point arguing semantics with someone who considered a restraining order a communication barrier. Rangers maintain magical boundaries and enforce compliance with wilderness preservation statutes, he said flatly. "Please don't touch active wards." The clipboard chirped and displayed a new notification. Protocol reminder, subjects must remain at least 3 feet from active restoration sites. Ashen continued working in silence, hoping she'd lose interest, but Sely only shifted closer, producing a small notebook from her pocket. The proximity warning throbbed again on his forearm, not because she'd increased the distance between them, but because proximity alerts intensified when the subject leaned closer than regulation permitted. Which she did constantly. "Is it true that rangers can see magical auras? Can you track ley lines with that compass? What's the strangest creature you've ever contained?" The questions tumbled out in rapid succession as she sketched the ward patterns in her notebook. Ashen closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. "We maintain boundaries between magical and non-magical realms." "Yes." "A 3-headed singing mushroom that caused hallucinations," he responded curtly, surprising himself by answering it all. His clipboard beeped in warning, perhaps detecting the slight thaw in his demeanor. "A singing mushroom? That's amazing." Cely's face lit up, and she flipped to a fresh page in her notebook. Was it harmonizing with itself? Did it have a preferred genre? Was it delicious? "It wasn't," Ashen stopped himself. "We don't eat confiscated magical specimens." Ashen blinked. Why had he said that? He never joked with civilians. Definitely not about protocol breaches. But someone must have. That's how you'd know it causes hallucinations, right? Ashen carefully adjusted another ward stone, refusing to meet her eyes. The report was comprehensive. He could practically feel her grin. "So you tried it." "I did not." He glanced up, realized his mistake immediately when he saw the triumphant gleam in her eye. The previous ranger on duty documented the effects. Section 12 of the report clearly stated, "You totally ate a singing mushroom." Sely laughed, the sound carrying across the clearing. By the pond, Glitterhoof snorted loudly, which Ashen could have sworn sounded like amusement. "I did my job," Ashen said firmly. "Which is what I'm attempting to do now." He focused on the final ward stone, connecting it to the circuit with practiced precision. The entire perimeter illuminated briefly as the system came online, a shimmering dome of protective magic that would keep ordinary forest creatures out and their problematic guest in. The glow faded to invisibility, but Ashen could still feel the subtle hum of the wards. As the sun climbed higher, Ashen's stomach growled audibly. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, too focused on repairing the damage from Cely's latest magical disaster. The sprites hadn't just scattered his ward stones, they'd also found his emergency rations pack and transformed the contents into pulsing decorative mushrooms that emitted tiny musical notes when touched. Sely disappeared briefly and returned with what appeared to be a hastily assembled meal, oddly shaped bread, some forest berries, and steaming tea in mismatched cups. "Peace offering," Sely said, echoing her earlier words to the unicorn. "I'm really sorry about your maps, and your tent, and your regulation perimeter stones." She placed the food on a clean piece of cloth between them. The tea smelled unexpectedly wonderful, cinnamon and something wild he couldn't identify. Ashen eyed the offerings suspiciously. "Where did you get this?" "I always carry emergency supplies," she said, gesturing to her battered bag. "The bread's a bit squashed from when Glitterhoof inflated my pack, but it's still good. And I found some blackroot for the tea, it helps with magical fatigue." Against his better judgment, Ashen accepted the cup, their fingers briefly brushing. A small magical current passed between them, causing the tea to momentarily shimmer with golden specks. They both pretended not to notice. Glitterhoof observed this interaction with raised eyebrows, pausing his splashing to watch. Ashen sipped the tea cautiously, then blinked in surprise. It tasted like summer evenings and forest clearings, the exact flavor of his first successful ward casting as an apprentice. A memory flickered unbidden. 17 years old, dirt-smudged hands, his mentor clapping him on the shoulder. That tea shouldn't know that. She shouldn't know that. How could she possibly know? "It adjusts to whatever your magic needs," Sely explained, misreading his expression. "My grandmother taught me how to brew it. Makes different patterns for different people." She gestured to his cup. "Yours has little constellations. Very precise. Very rangery." Ashen examined the faint star-like patterns in his cup. "That's not a regulation brew." "Definitely not," she agreed cheerfully. "Want more?" He did, but declined on principle. His clipboard dinged softly, displaying, "Reminder, official break period concluded. Resume duties." "I need to finish the incident report," Ashen said, rising smoothly to his feet. The slight disappointment on Sely's face was best ignored. "The wards are stable. Try not to disrupt them." "I would never," she protested, then seemed to reconsider. "Well, not on purpose anyway." "Intent is irrelevant in magical compliance violation," he recited automatically, then paused. "But thank you. For the tea." Her smile was unexpectedly bright, like sunshine breaking through forest canopy. Ashen turned away before he could analyze that particular thought. The day passed in tense coexistence. Ashen completed his reports, catalogued the sprite damage, and recalibrated his enchanted compass, which had developed an annoying tendency to point directly at Sely instead of magnetic north. Meanwhile, Sely attempted multiple approaches to befriend the unicorn, each ending in increasingly creative rejection. By mid-afternoon, she sported a tangled crown of twigs in her hair, courtesy of Glitterhoof's latest rebuff. "I think we're making progress," she announced, dropping beside Ashen where he sat examining his maps. "He only turned my hair into a bird's nest this time, instead of summoning actual birds." "Fascinating," Ashen murmured, not looking up. He traced the route to the Cradle of Echoes with his finger, calculating travel time. 3 days minimum, accounting for the unicorn's incooperative nature. 3 days with a chaos magnet and a resentful magical creature. The Bureau would owe him significant overtime. "Is that where we're heading?" Sely leaned close, peering at the map. Her hair tickled his shoulder, carrying the scent of wildflowers and oddly burnt cinnamon. "The cradle looks pretty far." "It's the only sanctuary with the proper containment fields for unicorns," Ashen said, subtly shifting away. "The Bureau has protocols for handling Class A magical beings." "He has a name, you know," Sely said. "Glitterhoof doesn't want to be handled or contained. He's the last of his kind. He just wants to be free." Ashen finally looked at her. "If that were true, he wouldn't have issued a restraining order against you." "That's just a temporary disagreement between friends," she insisted. "You're not friends. You attempted an unauthorized summoning, violated his territory, and triggered a Bureau alert." Ashen tapped the map. "The cradle will ensure his protection and proper magical integration. It's for his own good. Cely's expression clouded. That's what people always say when they're taking away someone's choices. Something in her tone made Ashen pause. His clipboard pinged with a notification, subject displaying signs of emotional distress. Refer to Protocol 394B. He dismissed the alert with a swipe of his finger. The Bureau's sanctuary system has preserved magical species for centuries. Preserved? Like pickles. Sely stood abruptly. I'm going to gather more blackroot. We'll need it for the journey. Ashen watched her walk away, keeping carefully within the ward boundaries but as far from him as possible. His forearm tingled as she reached the edge of the proximity spell's range. The clipboard displayed another message: emotional fluctuation detected in escort subject. Recommend stabilization measures. Noted, he muttered, returning to his maps. By the fire that evening, an unexpected calm had settled over their camp. Glitterhoof had retreated to the far edge of the wards, seemingly asleep, but occasionally opening one eye to check on them. Sely had returned with not just blackroot, but also several edible mushrooms and wild onions, which she'd combined into a surprisingly palatable stew. This isn't terrible, Ashen admitted after his second helping. Sely grinned. High praise from Sparkly Menace himself. I'll add it to my resume. Do you have an actual profession? Ashen found himself asking. Besides disturbing magical creatures. I'm a magical creature liaison, she said proudly. Self-appointed but effective. Effective at what? Causing magical incidents? Cely's smile didn't falter. At understanding. Most magical beings don't want bureaucracy, they want someone who sees them as they are. She stirred the fire with a stick. Like your singing mushroom. Did the Bureau forms have a checkbox for appreciates jazz or prefers ballads? Ashen was silent for a moment. No, he finally said. They did not. See? Details matter. She leaned forward, the firelight dancing in her eyes. So what made you become a ranger? Love of paperwork? Natural talent for frowning? The question caught him off guard. Most people didn't ask. They assumed rangers were born humorless and fully equipped with regulation handbooks. The structure, he said after a moment, surprising himself with his honesty. I function better with clear boundaries. Sely nodded thoughtfully. So how does one become a professional boundary maker? Is there a school for scowling? Somehow, Sely convinced Ashen to explain the ranger qualification process. As he described the grueling trials, his voice softened slightly. The 3-year apprenticeship, the wilderness survival tests, the magical containment challenges. My final test was rescuing a frost phoenix chick from the northern peaks, he found himself saying. Nearly froze to death, but the mother phoenix, he trailed off, realizing he was sharing far more than necessary. What happened with the mother phoenix? Sely asked gently, her usual chaotic energy temporarily subdued. Something about her voice, gentle but not prying, unlocked a part of him that had been rusted shut for years. She didn't treat it like a report. She just listened. The firelight caught in her eyes, reflecting genuine interest. Ashen studied her for a long moment, then glanced at his clipboard, which had powered down for the night. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire. Ashen rarely discussed the incident, it wasn't relevant to his duties, and explaining it inevitably led to uncomfortable questions about his decisions that day. She sacrificed herself to save both her chick and me from an avalanche, Ashen finally said, voice low. I still don't know why. He immediately stood, regretting the admission. The perimeter should hold now. Don't cross it. His tone returned to professional detachment, but as he walked away he felt Cely's gaze following him. In his peripheral vision, he saw Glitterhoof now back in his smaller barrier, deliberately setting something small and crafted on the ground before turning away. Only when Ashen reached his repaired tent did he realize the unicorn had somehow knitted what appeared to be a tiny phoenix figure, which now faced Ashen's shelter with remarkable accuracy. He stared at it for a long moment. The yarn colors matched perfectly, deep ember red and storm cloud gray. No one knew those details. No one but him. Inside his tent, away from curious eyes, Ashen removed his ranger insignia and held it in his palm. The small metal badge glowed softly in the darkness, a reminder of oaths taken and boundaries maintained. He closed his fist around it, feeling the edges press into his skin. In his 8 years of service, he'd never questioned the Bureau's methods. Protection required containment. Safety demanded structure. But Cely's words echoed in his mind. That's what people always say when they're taking away someone's choices. His clipboard lit up with a final evening notification. Ranger emotional state, deviation detected. Recommend reset protocol before morning departure. Ashen switched off the device completely, a minor act of rebellion in itself. Tomorrow would be complicated enough without the Bureau's emotional algorithms monitoring his every thought. He lay back on his bedroll, listening to the night sounds of the forest, and the soft humming from outside his tent, where Sely was apparently singing what sounded like a lullaby to an unwilling unicorn. Ashen closed his eyes, but sleep remained distant. For the first time in years, the boundaries he'd so carefully maintained felt less like protection and more like limitation. He told himself it was simply fatigue from the Sprite incident. Nothing to do with wide eyes and firelight, or questions no one else bothered to ask. Nothing at all.
5. Welcome to Wayward Hollow. Cely's toe caught on a protruding root for the third time that morning, but she barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on the swirling fog ahead, which seemed to part and reform like it was breathing. Her feet ached. She'd managed to conjure makeshift shoes from a spare shirt and some vine, but they weren't exactly regulation ranger boots. Still, Cely prided herself on adaptability. Is that? She stopped, squinting through the mist. A wooden signpost materialized, arrows pointing in seemingly random directions. As they approached, one of the arrows swiveled with a creak, aligning itself directly toward them. The words carved into it shifted and reformed, this way to wherever you secretly want to go. Oh! Cely clapped her hands together. We've reached Wayward Hollow. Ashen consulted his clipboard with a frown. We're off schedule. We shouldn't have reached the village until tomorrow afternoon. Maybe the forest knows we need a proper bath and a real bed, Cely suggested, bouncing on her toes. I've heard the woods around here shift to accommodate weary travelers. The unicorn behind them snorted derisively, its horn gleaming with what Cely could only interpret as judgment. The forest does not accommodate anyone, Ashen said flatly. That would be a direct violation of Conservation Code 47B, which clearly states that enchanted ecosystems must maintain geographical constancy. Cely rolled her eyes. Well, either we walked faster than you calculated, or the magical forest is being nice. I vote for door number 2. As they continued forward, the path beneath them transformed. Forest dirt gave way to smooth cobblestones that seemed to adjust their color with each step. Cely looked down in delight as sparkly pink stones appeared beneath her feet. She hopped a few times, watching the pink intensify with her excitement. That's so pretty. She pointed at the ground. Look, they match how we feel. Sure enough, beneath Ashen's steady stride, the cobblestones darkened into a path of stormy gray. He scowled. Of course the ground was tattling. Emotional manifestation via pavement? Completely unnecessary. Behind him, Glitterhoof trotted along, leaving behind a trail of irritated silver hoofprints. The unicorn looked thoroughly unimpressed. The village of Wayward Hollow emerged from the mist like a painting being revealed. Quaint cottages with curiously moving chimneys lined the winding path. Gardens bloomed with flowers that turned to follow Cely's movements. Even the clouds overhead seemed deliberately arranged, forming shapes that looked suspiciously like unicorns and ranger hats. As they entered the village square, an apple tree bent one of its branches toward Cely, offering a perfectly ripe fruit. She reached for it, but before her fingers could touch the apple, the tree extended further, practically shoving the fruit at her face. Thank you. She accepted the apple, and the tree wiggled its branches in what seemed like pleasure. Sely bit into it, tart sweetness exploded across her tongue. Oh my gods, this is amazing. Ashen, you have to try one. Ashen approached the tree, which immediately straightened its branches, lifting its fruit well out of reach. His clipboard hovered protectively between him and the plant, emitting a low warning buzz. The tree doesn't seem to like your clipboard, Sely observed, trying not to smile. The tree, Ashen said with exaggerated patience, is demonstrating typical behavior for enchanted flora in regulated zones. It's selecting preferred magical signatures. Glitterhoof huffed what sounded remarkably like a laugh. Another tree extended its branches toward Sely, offering what appeared to be a freshly baked cinnamon pastry wrapped in a leaf. The scent wafted toward her, exactly the treat she'd been daydreaming about for the last mile. How did you know? She whispered to the tree, accepting the pastry with both hands. The tree's leaves rustled in a shrug. Wayward Hollow's enchantments are calibrated to travelers' desires, Ashen explained, reading from his clipboard. Though such accommodations are technically in violation of Bureau standards for travel neutrality. You mean the village tries to make people happy? Sely asked, her mouth full of pastry. How terrible. Ashen's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Sely spotted a building at the far end of the square. Unlike the other structures, this one seemed to be subtly moving, windows expanding and contracting like gentle breathing, the roof tiles rearranging themselves into different patterns. A wooden sign hung over the door, the words "The Fickle Feather Inn" painted in color-shifting letters. The Fickle Feather Inn, perfect, Sely exclaimed, already starting toward it. The cobblestones beneath her feet turned a brighter pink, practically glowing with her excitement. It's the only approved accommodation in Wayward Hollow, Ashen said, flipping through his ranger handbook with a deepening frown. Though I should warn you about its reactive nature. Sely was already halfway through the door before he finished speaking. The moment she crossed the threshold, the entire inn seemed to exhale in welcome. Lamps brightened, a fire roared to life in the hearth, and the floorboards adjusted their temperature to a pleasant warmth beneath her makeshift shoes. The lobby was cozy chaos, mismatched furniture that rearranged itself as guests walked by, a coat rack that reached for Sely's bag with wooden fingers, and a reception desk made from what appeared to be a living tree that had decided to grow horizontally. Behind the desk stood a tall woman with hair that shifted colors like an aurora, currently a welcoming shade of sunset orange. She looked up as they entered, her eyes twinkling with something that made Sely feel like the woman knew exactly why they were here, before they said a word. Welcome, welcome. The innkeeper's voice was musical, each word hanging in the air with faint sparkles. We have exactly what you need, though perhaps not what you think you want. She winked at Sely, whose cheeks flushed slightly. The registration book on the desk flipped open by itself, pages ruffling until it found an empty spot. A quill lifted from its inkwell, hovering expectantly. Ashen stepped forward with a clipped nod. 2 rooms, please. Bureau-approved accommodations for a ranger escort mission. He reached for the quill, but it darted away from his fingers, diving toward the page and scribbling something of its own accord. Ink flourished across the paper in elegant loops. The innkeeper leaned over, examining what the quill had written. Her hair shifted to a curious lavender. How interesting, she said, tapping the page. The inn says you need 1 room, the Harmony Suite. Ashen's entire body locked up. No. Absolutely not. Bureau guidelines were very clear about emotional proximity affecting containment magic, especially in enclosed sleeping quarters. That's unacceptable, Ashen said immediately. Bureau protocol clearly states that separate accommodations must be provided for. His clipboard interrupted with a sharp ding. Ashen glanced down at the screen, which flashed with a new message: Magical Conservation Protocol, proximity requirements must be maintained. Sely peered at the message. What does that mean? It means, Ashen said through gritted teeth, that the enchantment binding us together requires close proximity, especially during rest periods when magical energies regenerate. He looked like he'd rather eat his clipboard than continue. Separate rooms would violate the terms of the escort spell. One room it is then, Sely said brightly. Look how much gold will save the bureau. Ashen looked physically pained. Meanwhile, the innkeeper had turned her attention to Glitterhoof, who stood in the doorway with visible reluctance. And for our distinguished four-legged guest, we have our premium stable accommodations. Freshly prepared, of course. She gestured toward the window, where Sely could see a luxurious stable that certainly hadn't been there when they arrived. As they watched, the structure transformed, adding what appeared to be a private knitting corner, a waterfall grooming station, and privacy curtains woven from silvery thread. Glitterhoof's ears perked up for the first time since Sely had met him. The unicorn trotted toward the stable with newfound enthusiasm, pointedly ignoring them both. The innkeeper handed the unicorn what appeared to be a do not disturb sign that pulsed with protective enchantments. Glitterhoof took it delicately in his teeth, looking smugly satisfied. Now for you too, the woman said, producing a key that changed shape as she held it. The Harmony Suite awaits. Top of the stairs, down the hall, third door on the left. Or possibly the right, it does move occasionally. The stairs creaked welcomingly as Sely bounded up them, Ashen following with measured steps. The hallway stretched longer than the building's exterior should have allowed, doors lining both sides. Some had numbers, others had nature scenes painted on them, and one appeared to be made entirely of flowing water. Third door, Sely muttered, counting. 1, 2, there. She pointed to a door carved with intricate vines that seemed to grow as they watched. The flowers blooming along the wooden vines were pink, the same shade as the cobblestones had turned beneath her feet. The door swung open before either of them could use the key, revealing a cozy room with a roaring fireplace, plush armchairs, and bay windows overlooking the village. Dominating the center of the room was a single bed, suspiciously large, draped with silken sheets and scattered with rose petals. Ashen stopped so abruptly that Sely bumped into his back. This is inappropriate, he stated, his voice even more clipped than usual. The instant he spoke the words, the room shifted. The rose petals vanished with tiny popping sounds, and the bed split into two with a dramatic groan, though the resulting twin beds remained uncomfortably close together, barely arm's length apart. Better? Sely asked, barely suppressing a laugh. Ashen didn't reply, but the set of his shoulders relaxed marginally. He entered the room, immediately beginning a methodical inspection with his regulation detection wand. The device beeped frantically at everything, the self-fluffing pillows, the windows that adjusted their view based on the looker's preference, the flowers on the side table that changed color to match Sely's clothing. Sely ignored his inspection and bounced onto the bed nearest the window. The moment she touched it, the mattress adjusted to her preferred softness, and the scent of lavender wafted up from the sheets. A small noise of pleasure escaped her. After days of sleeping on the ground, the bed felt like a cloud cradling her tired body. This place is amazing, she declared, flopping back dramatically. I never want to leave. We depart at dawn, Ashen replied without looking up from his inspection of the baseboards. The Bureau expects us to reach the Cradle of Echoes within 7 days. Always the Bureau, Sely sighed, but her heart wasn't in the complaint. The mattress was too comfortable for her to muster proper indignation. As the afternoon deepened into evening, they settled into an awkward routine in the shared space. Sely attempted to organize her scattered belongings while Ashen meticulously unpacked his regulation-issued travel kit, placing each item at precise angles on his side table. The small washroom became another source of careful negotiation. Ashen insisted on schedules, 10 minutes each, maximum efficiency, while Sely kept getting distracted by the enchanted mirror that offered unsolicited but strangely accurate fashion advice. When she finally emerged in her sleep clothes, a mismatched set featuring tiny dancing unicorns that she'd hastily packed during her original expedition, she found Ashen standing rigidly by the window. He wore what could only be described as regulation sleepwear, navy pants and a matching short-sleeved shirt, both pressed to military precision, with a Ranger Division sigil on the breast pocket. Their eyes met briefly before both quickly looked away. The lights in the room dimmed slightly of their own accord, and soft music began playing from nowhere, a gentle melody that reminded Sely of spring rain. "Did you do that?" Ashen asked, gesturing at the lights. "No," Sely replied, sitting cross-legged on her bed. "I think the room is trying to set a mood." Ashen's expression suggested he'd rather wrestle another glitter beetle swarm than acknowledge that statement. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the soft music and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Sely had never been good with silence. "So," she said finally, hugging her knees to her chest, "have you always been this?" She gestured vaguely at his perfectly pressed clothes and rigid posture, searching for the right word. Ashen raised an eyebrow. "Competent? Professional? Adherent to magical regulations designed to prevent disaster?" he offered dryly. Sely grinned. "I was going to say tense, but those work too." Something flickered across his face, annoyance certainly, but perhaps a hint of amusement buried beneath it. "Maintaining proper protocol isn't tension, it's responsibility," he said, but the words lacked their usual edge. "You can be responsible without looking like you've swallowed a broom," Sely pointed out. "I'm responsible. Well, mostly. Occasionally. When absolutely necessary." "You summoned a unicorn illegally and triggered a level 2 magical emergency," Ashen reminded her, but his tone was lighter than she'd heard before. Details. She waved a hand dismissively. "But I did make excellent stew last night, so clearly I have some responsible qualities." "The stew was adequate," Ashen conceded, finally sitting on the edge of his bed. "That's practically gushing praise from you," Sely said, delighted. "I'm going to remember this moment forever." Ranger Ward admitted my cooking skills were adequate. "I should get a commemorative plaque." The corner of Ashen's mouth twitched upward. Not quite a smile, but the closest Sely had seen. Their conversation continued, gradually becoming less stilted. Sely told him about her childhood fascination with magical creatures, how she'd been caught at age 9, trying to lure a family of frost sprites into her bedroom with sugar cubes and peppermint. "My parents were furious, but the sprites thought it was hilarious. They frosted all our windows for weeks afterward, little pictures of me falling on my face." "That explains a lot," Ashen said, but the harsh lines around his eyes had softened. "What about you?" Sely asked. Little Ashen Ward couldn't have dreamed of growing up to issue citations and frown at regulation violators. "Actually, I did," he said, surprising her. "My grandfather was a ranger. He used to let me read his field journals." Sely tried to picture a miniature version of Ashen, solemn-faced and eager, poring over dry accounts of magical containment procedures. It was oddly endearing. "Did he teach you forest magic too?" she asked. Something closed off in Ashen's expression. "Some. He died before my training was complete." "I'm sorry," Sely said softly. She nearly reached across the gap between their beds to touch his hand, but stopped herself. Ashen shrugged stiffly. "It was a long time ago." Sely noticed that for the first time since they'd met, Ashen's clipboard wasn't hovering at his side. It lay silent on the bedside table, its screen dark. "You turned it off," she observed, nodding toward the clipboard. "Evening protocol," he said quickly. "Conservation of magical energy." Sely hummed, unconvinced but unwilling to push. Instead, she asked about his favorite places in the forest, and was surprised when he actually answered, describing a hidden waterfall where rainbow moss grew in patterns that predicted the next day's weather. When Ashen asked about her work with magical creatures, Sely lit up, describing her successes with the frost sprites and a family of temperamental mushroom guardians. "They're misunderstood, most of them," she explained. "Everyone wants to control the magic, but nobody wants to communicate with the beings creating it." As they talked, Sely noticed Ashen almost smile at one of her jokes about bureaucratic filing systems. In that moment, the flickering firelight caught the angles of his face just right, softening them, and the room's temperature seemed to rise slightly. Without thinking, the words tumbled out of Sely's mouth. "You know, when you're not scowling, you're actually kind of hot." The statement hung in the air between them. Sely's eyes widened in horror at what she just said. Her hand clapped over her mouth, but it was too late. The words were already loose, dancing through the room like mischievous sprites. Ashen froze completely, his expression a perfect mask of shock. The room, however, had no such reservations about reacting. The beds suddenly pushed together with a decisive thump, closing the gap between them. The lights dimmed further to a romantic glow, and the music shifted to something slow and sweetly intimate. With a loud gurgling sound that broke the stunned silence, a heart-shaped bathtub materialized in the corner of the room, filling itself with steaming water. Rose petals materialized and scattered across the surface, and tiny enchanted candles flickered into existence around its rim. Sely wanted to dissolve into the floorboards. "I didn't mean, that is, the words just..." She buried her face in her hands, peeking through her fingers at Ashen's reaction. His ears had turned bright red, visible even in the dimmed lighting. He stood abruptly, so stiff that Sely thought he might actually shatter if someone touched him. "I'll sleep in the hallway," he announced, his voice raised half an octave from its usual deep tone. His ears were scarlet. He didn't even stop to grab his pack, just clutched his pillow like a shield and evacuated like the room might explode into heart-shaped glitter. "Ashen, wait," Sely called, mortified yet unable to stop a small smile from forming. "You don't have to, the room is just being dramatic." But the door had already closed behind him, leaving Sely alone with a heart-shaped bathtub, and the distinct sense that she just complicated their journey in ways the Bureau definitely hadn't approved. From the stable window across the courtyard, Glitterhoof slowly lowered his knitting, gave her the most withering unicorn side-eye she'd ever seen, and pulled the privacy curtains shut with a sharp flick of magic.
6. Cursed hot springs and honest words. Ashen folded his last sock with more force than the regulation handbook recommended. The crisp green fabric yielded under his fingers as he creased it perfectly, adding it to the geometrically precise stack in his pack. His movements were mechanical, practiced, a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. 17 pairs. All accounted for. His hovering clipboard pulsed an irritating amber, the notification growing more insistent with each passing minute. Proximity warning, 118 feet and increasing. Ashen deliberately ignored it, focusing instead on the methodical reorganization of his field kit. Bandages. Classified. Enchanted compass. Classified. Standard issue Ranger rations. The clipboard drifted directly into his line of sight, its glow intensifying. Proximity warning, 127 feet and increasing. Ashen closed his eyes, exhaled slowly through his nose, and counted to 10. It didn't help. The morning's argument played through his mind with painful clarity. But they're lost. Sely had insisted over her ridiculously colorful breakfast porridge, leaning across the table with that passionate gleam in her eyes. The Sprite foxes need to return to their ancestral grounds before the frost moon, or they'll lose their shimmer. Our mission parameters are clear, he'd responded, tapping his ever-present clipboard. Regulation 37B explicitly states that all primary objectives must be completed before secondary missions can be considered. The unicorn must reach the Cradle of Echoes within the designated timeframe. Her face had fallen then just for a moment, before she'd rallied with that stubborn lift of her chin. And what if helping others is more important than your timetable? What if beings with actual feelings matter more than checkboxes? The regulations exist for a reason. Do you ever think about anything besides your precious rule book? Her voice had risen, drawing stares from the other patrons of Wayward Hollow's dining room. But it wasn't her volume that had made him flinch. It was the hurt in her eyes, raw and unexpected, followed by disappointment. He hadn't anticipated how much that look would bother him. It echoed louder than it should have. More than any violation. More than any infraction. That look said you're not listening, and the worst part was, she was right. The clipboard nudged against his arm, practically trembling with urgency. Proximity warning, 149 feet and increasing. Fine, he muttered, snapping his pack closed with more force than necessary. The common room of the Wayward Hollow Inn seemed to sense his mood. The previously cheerful yellow walls had dimmed to a muted gray, and the fire in the hearth crackled with agitation. Stepping outside, Ashen squinted against the morning sun. The cobblestone streets twisted before him, decorated with the inn's signature enchantment, emotional footprints that revealed the path of previous travelers. Most were soft blues and contented greens, tourists enjoying their visits. Cely's trail wasn't difficult to spot. Glittering footprints pulsed with vibrant orange, irritation, and beneath it, a deep indigo that his ranger training identified as disappointment. They led eastward, away from the village center. Ashen followed the emotional breadcrumbs with practiced efficiency, checking his compass against the pulsing indicator on his clipboard. His were slate gray. Cely's burned orange and deep indigo. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look down again. The path wound through increasingly sparse buildings until the cobblestones gave way to soft meadow grass. In the distance, peculiar stone formations jutted from the earth like crooked teeth. A metallic cry came from behind him, high-pitched and anxious. "Sir! Sir Ranger! Most esteemed guardian!" With a barely suppressed sigh, Ashen turned. The talking sword he'd reluctantly acquired at the village marketplace vibrated in its scabbard, the blue runes along its blade pulsing faintly through the leather. "What is it, Valor?" The sword's hilt wiggled free enough to reveal its face, a set of runes that rearranged themselves into an approximation of anxious eyes. "I believe, most respectfully, sir, that your assigned ward has entered the Whisperwell Fields. A most treacherous location for the uninitiated. Perhaps, if I may suggest with all due respect." "Thank you, Valor." Ashen cut off the weapon with a curt nod and continued forward. "Should I activate the emergency duet protocol?" the sword asked meekly. Ashen shut the scabbard flap before it could elaborate. The sword had proven itself more adept at nervous commentary than actual protection, but at least its encyclopedic knowledge occasionally proved useful. Whisperwell Fields, the name tickled something in his memory from ranger training. A magical location certainly, but he couldn't recall specific warnings. The meadow air grew increasingly warm as he approached the stone circle, a dense mist rising from the ground in iridescent swirls. His boots left practical steadfast gray prints beside Cely's glittering trail. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Then he saw her. Sely sat cross-legged in the center of a circle of moss-covered stones, beside what appeared to be a small, bubbling geyser of rainbow-colored steam. Her curls had frizzed wildly in the humidity, forming a chaotic halo around her downturned face. For once she wasn't talking or moving or causing magical mayhem. She just looked quiet. Small. Deflated. The glow she usually carried like armor had dimmed. Her fingers moved over the stone, but there was no sparkle in it. He paused at the edge of the stone circle, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar pang in his chest. "The proximity spell," he said stiffly, relying on procedure to mask his uncertainty. "You were exceeding safety parameters." Cely didn't look up, trailing her fingers absently through the colorful mist. "Of course," she replied, her voice lacking its usual brightness. "Never mind that I might want space, after being called a walking regulation violation." Had he said that? Probably. It sounded like something he would say, even if he couldn't remember the exact moment. Ashen shifted his weight, acutely aware that the Ranger Handbook contained no protocol for apologies. "We need to return to our scheduled departure time," he tried again. Cely's shoulders tensed visibly. "I know. Rules and schedules." She finally looked up, and the raw emotion in her eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. "You win. I'll go help Glitterhoof pack up his ridiculous travel grooming kit." Something about her defeated tone made Ashen's chest tighten. This wasn't right. Sely was supposed to argue, to push back with wild ideas and impulsive plans. Not surrender. He hesitated, then stepped into the stone circle, intending to offer something. What exactly, he wasn't sure. Immediately, the geyser erupted with a soft whoosh, engulfing them both in sweet-smelling, rainbow-hued steam. It tasted like summer berries and smelled like truth if truth had a scent. clean and undeniable. Ashen's gaze fell on a wooden sign previously hidden by moss. Truth Steam Geyser, speak only if you dare. His entire body seized with alarm. A magical truth compulsion? This was precisely why regulations existed, to prevent rangers from stumbling into enchanted hazards without proper preparation. Before he could retreat, Cely's voice cut through the mist. I don't actually hate your rules, she blurted out, looking startled at her own words. I just hate that they never bend, even when bending would help someone. The steam swirled around them, glowing faintly. Ashen felt words rising unbidden to his lips, pulled by an irresistible force. He tried to clamp his mouth shut, but the magic was insistent. I've bent rules before, he admitted, the confession feeling physically extracted from his chest. It cost someone their life. A fellow ranger. Helena. Helena's name hung in the mist between them, shimmering with a pain he normally kept locked away. Cely's eyes widened and she moved closer, the rainbow steam making her features softer, more vulnerable. You're afraid of failing, she said quietly. It wasn't a question, and the truth of it pierced him like a blade. The magic compelled her to continue. I'm afraid of never being enough. That's why I chase magical creatures, to prove I matter. Her hand reached for his unconsciously. When they look at me, even if they're annoyed, at least they see me. The steam thickened, swirling around them like a cocoon of color and magic. Ashen found himself stepping closer until mere inches separated them. The geyser bubbled more vigorously, sending up fresh plumes of rainbow mist. I see you, he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't intended to reveal. You're impossible not to see. The words came from somewhere beneath his carefully constructed walls, somewhere he rarely acknowledged existed. His hand lifted of its own accord, fingers brushing a damp curl from her cheek. The touch sent a ripple of magic across the geyser's surface, and multicolored sparks danced around them. Cely's breath caught. What do you see then? She whispered, her eyes searching his face. The truth compulsion pulled at him, dragging words from a place he kept strictly guarded. Someone who cares too much. Who jumps in without looking. Who makes me question everything I've relied on. His voice dropped lower. Someone who makes the world brighter just by existing in it. Her lips parted in surprise, and Ashen felt himself leaning forward, drawn by something more powerful than the geyser's magic. Their faces drifted closer, the steam wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Just as the distance between them narrowed to a breath, a metallic shriek shattered the moment. A threat. A most alarming, potentially catastrophic. Valor crashed through the stone circle, unsheathed and glowing frantic blue. The sword's runes flashed in patterns of distress as it whirled in the air between Ashen and Sely. Immediate action required. Danger detected. The sword's voice reached a pitch previously unknown to mortal ears. Ashen leapt back, ranger instincts taking over as he scanned for the danger. Where? What is it? Valor's blade trembled dramatically, pointing its tip at the edge of the clearing. There. The fiendish creature approaches with malice aforethought. Ashen followed the sword's direction to find a perfectly ordinary glowing squirrel gathering nuts at the base of a tree. The small creature paused, acorn clutched in its paws, and tilted its head curiously at the commotion. That, Ashen said flatly, is a luminescent red squirrel. Classification, harmless. Conservation status, abundant. But, Valor's glow dimmed with embarrassment. It was moving with such squirrel-like menace. The moment was thoroughly shattered. The truth steam dissipated, drifting away in tendrils of fading color. Ashen stepped back abruptly, his regulatory mask slipping firmly back into place as the magic's hold released him. He turned away from Cely's flushed face, unable to meet the disappointment in her eyes. We should return to the inn, he said stiffly, adjusting his ranger jacket. Departure is scheduled in 43 minutes. Right? Sely murmured, rising to her feet and brushing off her clothing with exaggerated care. Can't miss the schedule. Ashen led the way out of the stone circle, his posture rigid. His clipboard reappeared, dutifully noting proximity restored in satisfied green text. Everything was back to proper protocol. Everything except the lingering taste of truth on his tongue, and the memory of how close he'd come to crossing a line he'd sworn never to approach. "Valor," Sely said suddenly, catching up to walk beside the floating sword. "What exactly were you doing following us anyway?" The sword's runes rearranged into an expression resembling embarrassment. "Well, you see, fair maiden, the heroic code demands vigilant protection. I was merely fulfilling my sacred duty as a legendary blade of—" "You were spying," Sely translated, a hint of her usual humor returning. "Reconnaissance," Valor protested. "A noble tradition of sentinel observation dating back to the age of—" "Spying," Ashen confirmed, grateful for the distraction from his tumultuous thoughts. As they walked back toward Wayward Hollow, Ashen kept his eyes forward, his face impassive. But he remained acutely aware of Sely beside him, of the words that had passed between them in the truth steam, and of the almost moment that still hung unresolved in the air. His clipboard helpfully displayed their schedule for the day, complete with estimated travel times and regulated rest periods. Everything was organized, structured, safe. And yet, for the first time in years, Ashen found himself wondering if there might be space between the rules, space where something unexpected could grow.
7. Yarn and Vengeance. Cely's toes curled into the soft earth as the trees thinned, revealing what had to be the most magical sight she'd encountered since yesterday's truth steam geyser incident. But this was different. This was ancient. 7 enormous silver trees stood in a perfect circle, their massive trunks gleaming like polished metal in the dappled sunlight. Their branches had grown together over what must have been centuries, forming archways that seemed to beckon visitors inside. From those arched branches hung thousands of delicate silver threads, catching the light and sending it dancing across the forest floor. "We're here," she breathed, unable to contain her awe. The stitching circle. Glitterhoof snorted behind her, but it lacked the usual derision. Ashen remained silent, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. As Sely approached the nearest archway, the silver threads began to move, not from wind, she realized, but of their own accord, twisting and tinkling against each other like the gentlest wind chimes. The sound they made was almost musical, almost like voices. Whispering, singing, calling her forward. Without hesitation, she stepped through. The moment she crossed the threshold, the voices grew clearer, though she still couldn't make out words, just emotions. Joy. Sorrow. Hope. Longing. The voices were telling stories, she realized. Thousands upon thousands of stories, all at once. "Careful," Ashen called from behind her, voice tight. "This place isn't properly documented." Sely glanced back to see him scowling at his clipboard, flipping through glowing pages that seemed unusually sparse. She'd never seen him look so discomfited by his precious paperwork before. "The bureau files are incomplete," he admitted reluctantly. His hand moved to Valor's hilt, fingers curling around it without drawing the sword. Sely recognized the gesture now, his security blanket when faced with the unknown. He'd been doing that a lot these past 2 days, touching his sword, checking his clipboard, maintaining a careful distance. Ever since the truth steam had nearly pushed them into whatever that almost moment had been. The memory made her stomach flip uncomfortably. "Incomplete files?" She raised her eyebrows, forcing lightness into her tone. "Now that's something I never thought I'd hear you say. Isn't that against regulation number 12-7 whatever?" He didn't rise to the bait, just pressed his lips together and stepped through the archway, every muscle tense. Behind them, Glitterhoof entered, and the change was immediate and startling. The unicorn's silver-dappled coat seemed to absorb the light from the threads, glowing with an inner radiance that transformed him. His wild mane smoothed itself, shimmering like spun moonlight. His head lifted, neck arched proudly, and the perpetual look of annoyed disgust melted away, replaced by something ancient and knowing. "Glitterhoof?" Sely whispered, not entirely sure this was the same creature who'd been sabotaging her breakfast efforts for the past week. The unicorn didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he stepped delicately forward, hooves making no sound on the moss-covered ground, moving toward the center of the clearing where an enormous structure stood. Sely hadn't noticed it immediately, distracted by the singing threads, but now she couldn't look away. It resembled a loom, taller than Ashen and twice as wide, but made of what appeared to be solid light or crystal, constantly shifting between states of matter. Thousands of gleaming threads were stretched across its frame, some vibrant and pulsing with light, others faded to the barest silver whispers. "What is?" she began, but stopped as movement caught her eye. They emerged like dewdrops taking form, small translucent beings no taller than her knee, stepping out from hollow spaces in the silver trees. Their bodies seemed made of solidified morning light, neither fully solid nor fully spirit. As they moved across the clearing, they left momentary trails of luminescence behind them. When they spotted Glitterhoof, they froze collectively, then prostrated themselves, foreheads touching the earth. "The last weaver returns," they whispered in perfect unison, their voices blending like wind through reeds. Glitterhoof acknowledged them with a slight dip of his horn, a gesture so formal and unlike his usual behavior that Sely almost laughed from shock. The small beings rose and turned their attention to the human visitors. They surrounded Sely first, peering up with eyes like tiny captured stars. Their fingers, cool and feather-light, brushed against her arms, leaving trails of light that faded after a few seconds. "This one glows from within," they murmured approvingly. "Unbound magic. Unwritten pages." Sely wasn't sure whether to curtsy or thank them, or just stand very still. She opted for the latter, trying not to shiver at the strange sensation of their touch. The beings drifted toward Ashen, who took an immediate step backward, his hand tightening on Valor's hilt. "And this one," they tilted their heads in perfect synchronicity. "Ah, so many rules surrounding a heart that wishes to break them." Ashen's face flushed. "I am Ranger Ashen Ward of the Southern Jurisdiction," he said stiffly. "We're here on official escort business." The beings seemed utterly uninterested in his title or mission. They floated back toward Sely, one reaching up to take her hand. "Come," it said simply. "You wish to see." And she did. She absolutely did. The loom at the center of the clearing was pulling at her awareness like a physical tug. Without looking back at Ashen's undoubtedly disapproving face, she followed the small beings toward the structure. Up close, the loom was even more breathtaking. What she'd thought was crystal was something far more ephemeral, solid magic perhaps, constantly shifting between states. The threads woven through it varied dramatically, some thick and vibrant, pulsing with internal light, others gossamer thin and barely visible, some tangled together in complex knots, others stretched straight and true. "Fate threads," one of the stewards explained, noticing her fascination. "Each life, each possibility, woven together." Sely reached out instinctively, then pulled her hand back. "May I?" The steward nodded. "You may observe. The threads respond to those who seek understanding." She gently ran her fingers along a particularly vibrant blue thread that seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. The moment she touched it, the world disappeared. She stood in a sunlit glade, wildflowers bobbing gently in a warm breeze. Ashen was there, but different. His stern face softened, the perpetual crease between his brows smoothed away. He was looking at her with an expression she'd caught only glimpses of before, quickly hidden. Affection. Something deeper than affection. He leaned toward her, his hand rising to touch her cheek. The vision shifted abruptly. Darkness. Cold mist rising from cracked earth. She and Ashen running, stumbling, his hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt. Behind them, something ancient and hungry rising from the depths, a shadow with too many eyes, and Ashen, still gripping her hand, refusing to let go. Even as the world cracked around them. Even when it would have been easier to run. Sely jerked her hand away with a gasp, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. "The threads show what might be, not what must be," said a steward, its starlight eyes reflecting her own startled expression. "Since the last weaver abandoned the loom, fates have become untethered. Some say it brought chaos. Others call it freedom." The steward glanced meaningfully at Glitterhoof, who had moved to one of the archways, his back to the gathering as he examined a spot where the silver wood had cracked. "What do you mean, abandon the loom?" Sely asked, finding her voice again. Another steward floated forward, its light dimming slightly, as if in remembrance of something sorrowful. Unicorns were the weavers of destiny, it explained. They could see all paths, all possibilities. The last weaver was once the most skilled of all, until she chose to cut her own thread from the loom. Sely looked at Glitterhoof with new understanding. The sarcastic, difficult unicorn suddenly appeared in a different light, not just grumpy but burdened. Carrying the weight of a choice that had changed everything? But why would? Night approaches, interrupted one of the stewards, its light brightening as the forest around them darkened. The weaving glows brighter in darkness. Sure enough, as dusk settled around them, the clearing transformed. The thousands of hanging threads began to glow with a soft inner light, first silver, then blue, illuminating the circle with their ghostly radiance. The effect was breathtaking, like being inside a dome of starlight. The stewards retreated to their tree hollows, leaving behind small crystal fruits that gleamed with internal fire. Offerings, one explained before disappearing into its tree. Rest. Commune. Remember. Ashen, who had maintained a careful distance throughout the earlier interactions, began setting up camp at the edge of the circle, just within the magical perimeter that bound him to Sely by the escort enchantment. His movements were precise and regulation perfect, but Sely noticed how his eyes kept darting toward the glowing loom, betraying his curiosity despite himself. And when he looked at it, really looked, his mask faltered. Just for a breath. Like something in him wanted to believe in the kind of magic you didn't have to explain or file. Sely picked up one of the crystal fruits, turning it over in her hands. It was cool to the touch and smelled faintly of honey and rain. Everything about this place felt significant, ancient, and somehow deeply personal. She set the fruit down again and walked toward where Glitterhoof stood alone beneath the largest of the 7 arches. She stopped a respectful distance away, remembering all too well the magical restraining order. "Why did you leave?" she asked quietly. "Why abandon the weaving?" For a long moment, she thought the unicorn wouldn't answer. Glitterhoof remained perfectly still, the starlight reflecting in his coat. Then, just as she was about to apologize for intruding, a voice filled her mind, deep and ancient, resonating not through her ears but directly into her thoughts. She froze. Not because Glitterhoof had spoken, but because he never had. Not in words. Not like this. "Every thread I wove bound another creature to a path," Glitterhoof said, the mental voice tinged with both sorrow and defiance. "Who was I to decide?" The unicorn turned, facing Sely fully for the first time since they'd met. His eyes were no longer just eyes but windows into something vastly more profound, galaxies of experience, centuries of knowledge. "I chose freedom, for myself and for others," Glitterhoof continued, the mental voice vibrating through Sely's bones. "Some see it as abandonment. I call it the hardest choice I ever made." The unicorn's gaze intensified, seeming to look through her rather than at her. "You understand choices with consequences, don't you, little weaver?" Glitterhoof's gaze shifted meaningfully toward where Ashen sat alone by his regulation campfire, methodically checking his supplies, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. A weight settled in Sely's chest, something heavier and more complex than she'd been prepared for. It wasn't just about rescuing a unicorn anymore. It wasn't even about completing a quest. Something deeper was happening, something that connected her impulsive actions, Glitterhoof's ancient choice, and the stern ranger who pretended not to care. "I'm not a weaver," she whispered, turning back to Glitterhoof. "I'm just me. I mess things up. I break rules. I trigger emergency escorts." She tried to laugh, but it caught in her throat. "All creatures weave fate threads whether they know it or not," Glitterhoof replied, the mental voice gentler now. "Some tangles can be undone. Others create patterns more beautiful than any single thread could manage alone." The unicorn moved past her, walking toward the loom with a deliberate grace. As he approached, several of the threads began to glow more intensely, reaching out like living tendrils toward his horn. "Why did you let me find you?" Sely asked suddenly. "If you didn't want to be followed, you could have hidden better. You practically dared me to track you." Glitterhoof paused, not turning around. "Perhaps I needed to see if anything had changed." If the weaving could be mended. Can it? The unicorn didn't answer. Instead, he touched his horn to one of the glowing threads. A shiver passed through the entire structure, and several of the faded threads suddenly brightened, as if receiving new life. Sely glanced back at Ashen, who was watching the interaction with undisguised curiosity, his clipboard forgotten beside him. When he noticed her looking, his expression quickly reset to professional detachment, but not before she caught a flash of something else, wonder perhaps or longing. The growing understanding of what this quest might actually mean, for all of them, settled over Sely like a mantle. She'd started this journey thinking she'd be the hero who saved the last unicorn. Now she wasn't sure who was saving whom or from what. She walked toward the crystal fruits, picked one up and took a bite. It tasted of possibilities, bitter and sweet and strange all at once.
8. Risk management for enchanted idiots. Ashen squinted at the dawn light filtering through the canopy of silver trees. The pale golden rays cast long shadows across the stitching circle, turning dewdrops into tiny prisms that scattered light across the moss-covered ground. He'd positioned himself on a fallen log at the perimeter of their camp, deliberately facing away from where Sely had finally fallen asleep after hours of restless pacing. He hadn't slept. The memory of shared magic, of Sely's wonder and his own reaction to it, had looped through his thoughts like a stuck enchantment. Valor lay in pieces across the regulation maintenance cloth spread across his knees. The talking sword's components gleamed in the early morning light, its blue runes pulsing erratically as Ashen methodically disassembled the hilt. "I assure you, with all due respect, sir, that I am functioning at precisely 43.7% of optimal capacity," Valor announced nervously as Ashen removed its hilt crystal. The translucent blue stone flickered between his fingers like a panicked heartbeat. "Functioning is a generous term," Ashen replied, his voice low and measured. Valor had shut down entirely during their encounter with the mist sprites yesterday, leaving them to rely on Sely's chaotic but effective shield spell. Not that he'd admit how impressed he'd been by her quick thinking. His clipboard hovered at eye level, running diagnostics that flashed red more often than green. Each notification ping felt like an accusation. Ashen's hands moved with practiced precision as he leafed through a small leather-bound maintenance manual. The book was technically outdated. The Rangers had switched to enchanted tablets 5 years ago, but he preferred the reliability of paper. Magic had a way of glitching around Sely, and he couldn't risk losing access to critical information because her presence scrambled magical frequencies. "Perhaps if you used the polishing cloth from Section 7B instead of the standard issue," Valor began. "The standard issue cloth is specified in Regulation 42.3 for routine maintenance," Ashen interrupted, not looking up from his work. He felt Sely's gaze before he saw her. It wasn't just observation. It was the kind of quiet attention that made his spine itch and his heartbeat accelerate, even though she hadn't said a word. The weight of her attention pressed against his back, warming his skin through his ranger jacket. He deliberately kept his eyes on the sword components, though his movements slowed imperceptibly. Since her vision at the loom yesterday, something had shifted between them, a new awareness that felt both dangerous and inevitable. "The crystal's alignment is within acceptable parameters," he murmured, more to himself than the sword. "The malfunction must be elsewhere. Or perhaps the issue lies with the wielder," came a voice from his left. Ashen glanced up to see Bramble Quickwhistle approaching, the halfling cartographer's color-coded pack bobbing with each determined step. Their thick glasses caught the morning light as they adjusted them with one finger. "Rangers always fixing things that aren't the real problem," they commented, coming to a stop beside him and peering critically at the disassembled sword. Ashen raised an eyebrow but didn't respond, instead returning his attention to the crystal in his palm. The silence stretched between them. Bramble remained undeterred. "Your sword isn't malfunctioning because of its calibration. It's reacting to your emotional inconsistency." They unwrapped a perfectly organized breakfast bar, the wrapper color-coded to match the day of the week. Regulation 47 clearly states that enchanted equipment requires daily maintenance regardless of perceived functionality, Ashen responded stiffly. He began reassembling Valor's hilt, fingers moving with methodical precision. The sword emitted a satisfied hum as components locked back into place. Bramble rolled their eyes and took a neat bite of their breakfast bar. And what regulation covers pretending someone is a hazard when you actually find them fascinating? They asked pointedly, nodding toward Sely, who sat beneath the central stone arch attempting to repair her torn backpack with clumsy stitches. Ashen's hands faltered slightly, causing Valor to emit a distressed chime. His gaze involuntarily tracked to Sely, catching her expression of intense concentration, the same look she'd worn when touching the fate thread. Her tongue peeked out from between her teeth as she stabbed at the fabric with 2 large stitches, her curls falling across her face in the same chaotic pattern as her needlework. "My job is to escort and protect," he said finally, forcing his attention back to Valor. "Not to find anyone, anything." The correction felt hollow even to his own ears. Bramble made a skeptical noise around a mouthful of breakfast bar. "Emotional cartography is equally important as geographical, you know," they muttered, brushing crumbs from their meticulously pressed shirt before wandering away. Ashen exhaled slowly, willing his fingers to stop their uncharacteristic trembling as he completed Valor's reassembly. The sword hummed back to life, its runes settling into a steadier glow. "Forgive my impertinence," Valor whispered, "but your heart rate accelerated by 17% during that exchange." "Noted," Ashen replied curtly, sliding the sword back into its sheath. His clipboard floated closer, updating its diagnostic report with several concerning yellow indicators. The morning progressed with routine efficiency. They broke camp according to regulation timelines, though Glitterhoof deliberately tangled Ashen's perfectly rolled tent cords twice before huffing away to stand near Sely. The unicorn's silent judgment felt heavier than his packed gear, as Ashen methodically checked inventory against his hovering list. By midday, they'd reached the central clearing of the stitching circle, where ancient stone pillars formed a rough geometric pattern around a weathered platform. The site vibrated with residual magic, the kind that had lingered so long it had become part of the landscape itself. One of the elderly stewards, a woman with silver hair that mimicked the surrounding trees, had taken an immediate liking to Sely. Now she guided her through what appeared to be a protection spell, her gnarled hands gesturing at the air as Sely attempted to follow. Ashen found himself watching from the edge of the clearing, ostensibly documenting the magical parameters of the site on his clipboard. In reality, his attention kept drifting to Sely's movements. Her attempts at the protection spell were instinctually graceful but technically incorrect, her fingers positioned at angles that dispersed rather than focused magical energy. Despite this, her magic manifested as bright swirls of golden light that almost but didn't quite form a coherent shield. The steward nodded encouragingly before shuffling away, leaving Sely to practice alone. Her frustration was evident in the tightening of her shoulders as each attempt dissipated into sparkles that rained down around her. Against his better judgment, Ashen approached. His boots made no sound on the moss-covered ground, but Sely turned anyway, as if she'd sensed his presence. "Your form is compromising the spell integrity," he said, his voice emerging more gentle than intended. The words were regulation standard, but the tone wasn't. Sely looked up, surprise evident in her eyes. A small smile curled at the corner of her mouth. "Is the Great Ranger Ward offering to help me break something other than regulations?" she teased, but there was a genuine question beneath the banter. "Proper technique isn't breaking rules, it's honoring the structure of magic itself," Ashen responded, surprising himself with the philosophical turn. He hesitated, aware that he was stepping outside his official capacity as her escort. After a moment's consideration, he demonstrated the correct hand position, his own magic manifesting as precise geometric patterns of silver light that formed a perfect half-dome around them. The shield held for exactly 4 seconds, regulation demonstration time, before dissolving in a controlled fade. Sely watched intently, her eyes tracking his movements with unexpected focus. She attempted to mirror his positioning, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Like this?" she asked, her fingers still slightly misaligned, the magic gathering but wobbling unstably at her fingertips. Without thinking, Ashen stepped behind her, reaching around to adjust her hands. "Your index finger creates the anchor point," he explained, his voice low near her ear, "while your thumb and middle finger channel the flow." The moment his fingers touched hers, a current of magic surged between them, electric and immediate. Sely gasped softly as their energies synchronized, silver and gold light intertwining like metallic liquid. The protection spell formed instantly, far stronger than either could create alone. Too strong. It flared to life with a hum that vibrated in Ashen's chest, like standing inside a spell that had a will of its own. He should have pulled away. Regulation screamed at him to step back. But he didn't. He couldn't. Regulation 23.5 strictly prohibited unauthorized magical synchronization. The statute existed for good reason. Shared magic created unpredictable outcomes and psychological dependencies. As a ranger, Ashen was required to break magical contact immediately, file an incident report, and establish a minimum 6-foot distance until the residual energy dispersed. Ashen knew this. He'd written citations for lesser violations. Yet he remained connected, feeling the spell binding them into temporary magical resonance. Through the bond he sensed Cely's emotions, her wonder at their combined magic, her lingering uncertainty from the fate thread vision, and beneath it all, a warm current of feeling directed at him that made his breath catch. Their magic expanded, forming a dome of light around them both. The barrier wasn't just protective, it was responsive, adjusting to their shared energy with beautiful precision. Within the translucent shield, reflections appeared, echoes of possible futures similar to what Sely had described seeing in the loom. Ashen glimpsed himself smiling, actually smiling, with Sely beside him. His future self looked relaxed, the perpetual tension absent from his shoulders. The image shifted to show them standing back to back against an approaching shadow, their magics intertwined in a defensive array. Then it changed again to reveal them in what appeared to be the cradle of echoes, hands clasped as magic swirled around them. In that vision he was looking at her with an expression he'd never worn before, open, unguarded, filled with something that made his present self's chest constrict. "Are you seeing this?" Sely whispered, her voice vibrating through their connection. "Yes," he admitted, the word barely audible. The connection broke when Glitterhoof deliberately stomped nearby, the unicorn's hoof coming down with excessive force that reverberated through the ground. Their concentration shattered, and the protection dome dissolved into sparkling motes that rained down around them like golden and silver dust. Ashen stepped back quickly, his ranger training reasserting itself. He straightened his jacket and cleared his throat, aware of the flush spreading across his face. "That was an effective demonstration of proper technique," he managed, his voice unnaturally stiff. Sely stared at him, her eyes wide and lips slightly parted. "Was that supposed to happen?" she asked softly. "The visions?" "No," he answered truthfully. "That was an anomalous reaction." She took a half-step toward him. "Ashen, those futures we saw." His clipboard chose that moment to float aggressively into his line of sight, displaying a new notification in urgent red letters. "Unauthorized magical synchronization detected," followed by emotional compromise warning. The words glowed accusingly between them. Under normal circumstances, this alert would trigger an automatic report to headquarters, requiring a formal review of his fitness for duty. Synchronization incidents, especially those resulting in shared visions, were treated as serious breaches of magical containment protocol. Cely's expression fell as she read the notification. "I'm sorry," she said, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to get you in trouble." Again. For the first time in his career as a ranger, Ashen reached out and dismissed the alert without filing a report. The clipboard shuddered in apparent shock, its enchantment flickering as the notification dissolved. "Some regulations," he said carefully, "require contextual interpretation." Cely's surprised laugh was worth whatever reprimand might eventually come. Did Ranger Ward just bend a rule? She pressed a hand to her chest in mock astonishment. I might faint from shock. The corner of Ashen's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Bending, not breaking, he corrected. An important distinction. Of course, she agreed, eyes sparkling. Wouldn't want to compromise your ranger integrity. Indeed. He paused, suddenly uncertain. The magical connection had faded, but something else lingered, an awareness that couldn't be dismissed as easily as a clipboard notification. Your shield technique, he began awkwardly, showed significant improvement. I had a good teacher. Her smile was warm, free of her usual teasing. The sincerity in her expression made something in his chest tighten. From across the clearing, Glitterhoof watched them with ancient, knowing eyes. The unicorn pawed at the ground once, before turning away with what Ashen could have sworn was a resigned huff. We should rejoin the others, he said finally, gesturing toward where Bramble was meticulously labeling specimens near the central stone. Sely nodded, but as she turned to go, she asked quietly, the visions we saw, do you think they're real possibilities? Or just magical interference? Ashen considered the regulation response. Visions were unreliable, subjective phenomena not to be taken as predictive. Instead, he found himself saying, I don't know. But I saw them too. Her smile returned, smaller but somehow more significant. Good, she said simply, and walked ahead of him toward the camp. Ashen remained still for a moment, watching her go. His clipboard hovered expectantly at his shoulder, a new form already populating with the day's coordinates and observations. The box labeled Magical Anomalies remained empty, awaiting his input. He left the anomaly box blank. Then, for the first time, he stepped forward not because duty demanded it, but because he wanted to follow her.
9. The Shelter Spell. Sely watched the sky above the lavender mire darken at an unnatural pace, purple-black clouds swirling with internal lightning. The pressure change made her ears pop as she stared upward, transfixed by the geometric patterns forming overhead, perfect hexagons and spirals that no natural storm would create. All around them, the pale lavender reeds began to bend and whisper in a language just beyond understanding, their tips brushing against each other in warning. That's not a normal storm, she said, pointing at the mathematical precision of the cloud formations. A tingle ran up her spine, the kind she'd learned to associate with magical anomalies rather than mere weather. Emotional tempest, Ashen confirmed beside her, his voice tight. He pulled out his compass, the enchanted needle spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north or magical south or any direction at all. The magical resonance from the stitching circle must have attracted it. His eyes briefly met hers before darting away, and Sely felt that familiar tug of unfinished conversation. They hadn't really talked since their magical synchronization the day before, both pretending that the moment of connection hadn't happened, hadn't changed everything, hadn't revealed her feelings to him in a way that words never could. Sely scanned their surroundings, noting the absence of their companions. Where's Glitterhoof and Bramble? Different path, Ashen said, clipped and professional. Avoiding that patch of vindictive quicksand half a mile back. The proximity spell binding them together gave a warning pulse, like a magical heartbeat accelerating with anxiety. The first raindrops fell, heavy glowing purple droplets that sizzled when they touched the marshy ground. One landed on Sely's cheek and she gasped as someone else's memory flooded through her. A profound loss, a beloved creature vanishing into mist, the ache of a goodbye never spoken. She wiped it away, blinking rapidly. That's not regular rain. Emotional residue, Ashen confirmed, not quite looking at her. The storm is collecting feelings from across the region. Another drop hit her shoulder, filling her with a burst of unfamiliar joy, a child's first successful spell before fading. The rain began falling faster, each droplet a different emotional memory seeking a host. We need shelter, Ashen called over the rising wind, reaching for Valor. The sword trembled in his hand, its normally chatty runes flickering erratically, fading in and out like a failing light source. I regret to inform you, Valor announced with a nervous waver, that my protective capabilities are currently A crack of thunder drowned out the rest as the sword went completely dark, its enchantment temporarily overwhelmed by the storm's magical interference. Sely felt a spike of panic as the wind picked up, whipping her curls across her face. The mire wasn't safe in good weather. In a magical tempest, it could become actively hostile. She racked her brain for solutions, then remembered. The harmonic shelter spell, she shouted through the intensifying downpour. The stewards at the stitching circle taught me, but it needs 2 casters in emotional sync. And what if he wasn't? What if that moment in the stitching circle had been a fluke, just magic, not feeling? Another raindrop hit her neck, frustration not hers, as the lavender reeds around them began to whip into a frenzy, their gentle whispers becoming frantic warnings. The storm's outer bands spun faster, and behind Ashen, Sely could see a bolt of emotional lightning strike a nearby hillock. It left behind a perfect crater filled with crystallized tears, glittering and dangerous. Ashen's expression turned guarded. He'd remember what had happened last time their magic connected, how she'd been an open book to him, how he'd felt everything she'd been trying so desperately to hide. His hesitation was almost palpable, a full-body flinch before the pain. Another lightning strike, closer this time. A cloud of what looked like sparkling dust rose from the impact point, crystallized laughter perhaps, or fossilized wonder. "We don't have a choice," he finally said, moving to stand back to back with her. His shoulders were rigid with tension against hers. She felt him hesitate, just for a second. One breath. One heartbeat. Then his grip firmed. "Follow my lead." His hands found hers, fingers interlocking in the precise pattern the stitching circle stewards had demonstrated, right hand over left, fingers alternating, thumbs pressed to each other's wrists to form a circuit of shared energy. The moment they connected, Sely felt the now familiar rush of their magic mingling, his silver precision flowing into her golden intuition, like mercury and honey swirling together into something stronger than either alone. She closed her eyes, feeling the pattern of the spell taking shape between them. Ashen's magic was all regulation and structure, a perfect framework waiting for her to fill it with life and energy. She pushed her magic into his lattice, feeling the vibration as their energies harmonized, creating something neither could have managed alone. The spell expanded from their joined hands, creating a dome of shimmering light that rose above them, hardened and became a translucent shelter. Inside, the magic reshaped their environment, the soggy mire beneath their feet transforming into a small dry glade with soft moss and gently glowing flowers spreading outward from where they stood. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but within their bubble there was only peaceful quiet and the soft sound of their synchronized breathing. "It worked," Sely whispered, turning slowly to face Ashen. Their hands remained joined, neither quite willing to break the connection that kept the shelter stable. In the soft light of their magic, his usually stern face looked different, younger somehow, the perpetual furrow between his brows smoothed away. A drop of rain clung to his eyelash, catching the light. Without thinking, she reached up with their still joined hands and brushed it away with her thumb. He didn't pull back. "Why do you care so much about magical creatures?" he asked suddenly, his voice low and thoughtful. "It's more than just your job." His guard was down, gray eyes searching hers with genuine curiosity rather than professional assessment. The question caught Sely off guard. People usually demanded justifications for her failures, explanations for chaos left in her wake, but no one had ever asked her why before. "Because they're misunderstood," she answered, the shelter spell's harmonics encouraging emotional truth between them. "Everyone sees them as dangerous or useful or valuable, but rarely as just themselves." She looked down at their interwoven fingers, at the soft glow where their magic mingled. "No one looked at me and saw just Sely either. Always too chaotic, too emotional, too much magic leaking everywhere." The confession left her feeling exposed, but Ashen's fingers tightened around hers. "Like at the academy?" he prompted softly. Sely nodded, surprised he remembered that fragment from her rambling days ago. 3 different magical disciplines asked me to leave. Too unpredictable for alchemy. I made a cauldron sing once. Just sing. How was that grounds for expulsion? And evocation said my casting style was dangerously improvisational. As if innovation is a bad thing. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. And the third. Creature communication. Turns out they didn't actually want us communicating with the creatures, just controlling them. She frowned at the memory. I let a bother Sprite go because it was homesick. Apparently, that was worth a formal censure. The shelter pulsed around them, responding to her emotions. Tiny glowing sprites, manifestations of the spell, not real creatures, danced briefly along the curved walls before dissipating. What about you? She asked. Why did you become a ranger? And don't say to uphold magical regulations or I'll put another glitter sticker on your clipboard. That earned a genuine chuckle from him, the sound so unexpected that Celie's heart skipped. I joined because I wanted to protect both people and magical beings, he admitted. The balance is important. But somewhere along the way, I got lost in the paperwork. His eyes met hers, suddenly serious. You remind me of what it's supposed to be about. Is that a good thing? She whispered. Terrifying, he said, but yes. Outside their shelter, the storm hurled emotional lightning in furious strikes. Inside, something equally electrical crackled between them. I see you, he said quietly, echoing his words from the truth steam geyser, but this time without magic compelling him. His free hand rose hesitantly to her cheek. Sely, whatever regulation or reason he might have cited, faltered and died in his throat. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He didn't know when he'd stopped calculating the risks, only that in this moment he didn't care. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss as gentle as dawn, tentative at first, then deepening as the shelter around them pulsed with responding light, the moss beneath their feet suddenly sprouting tiny luminescent flowers that spiraled outward from where they stood. Celie's magic surged, responding to her emotions in a way she couldn't control. The glowing flowers climbed the walls of the shelter, tracing patterns of light across the translucent surface. She felt Ashen's surprise, then acceptance as the kiss continued, his usual rigid control softening into something warm and real. When they finally broke apart, the entire shelter had transformed into a garden of light, each flower pulsing gently with their combined magic. His eyes reflected the glow, wonder replacing his habitual wariness. That wasn't in the spell description, he murmured, looking at their creation. That's what happens when you go off-book, she replied with a small smile. Then maybe off-book is where the truth lives, he said, almost like he was confessing to the moss. They sat together as the storm continued outside, talking quietly about everything and nothing, childhood memories, magical mishaps, favorite creatures. The conversation flowed naturally, Ashen's usual reserve melting away within their shared creation. When exhaustion finally overtook them, they lay on the soft moss, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, protected from the emotional deluge by their combined power. The last thing Sely remembered before drifting off was Ashen absently stroking her hair, his other hand still linked with hers to maintain the shelter spell. Morning came with gentle insistence, sunlight filtering through their fading shelter, as the spell began to naturally dissipate. Sely woke slowly, curled against Ashen's chest, his arm still wrapped protectively around her. For a precious moment, his sleeping face was completely peaceful, years younger without the weight of regulations furrowing his brow. Then his eyes opened, reality rushing back in with the morning light. She felt him tense against her, watched the walls begin to rebuild behind his eyes as the shelter thinned above them, exposing them to the real world once more. This was, he began, already pulling away, sitting up and reaching for his ranger gear. Not a mistake, Sely interrupted firmly, though her heart cracked at his retreat. Even if you're scared. He didn't answer, just busied himself collecting his pack as the shelter dissolved completely around them, leaving them back in the mire with a storm-cleared sky. The lavender reeds stood tall again, no longer bending with warning, but the emotional gulf between them seemed wider than before. Sely sat among the rapidly fading magical flowers, watching him reattach valor to his belt, straighten his ranger insignia, and check his compass, all without meeting her eyes. The ranger was back, the man from last night carefully locked away. But Sely had seen him now, really seen him. And despite his withdrawal, Despite the way he was pretending nothing had happened between them, she knew one important truth. You couldn't unsee what had been revealed, couldn't unfeel what had been shared. No matter how many regulations he hid behind. Ashen, she said quietly. You can pretend all you want, but that shelter needed emotional harmony to work. It wouldn't have held if what happened between us wasn't real. He paused, compass in hand, but didn't turn around. I know, he said finally, his voice almost too low to hear. He still didn't turn. But he held the compass a little too tightly, like it might tell him something he already knew and didn't want to face. A small victory, but enough for now. Celie got to her feet, brushed the remaining moss from her clothes, and reached for her own pack. They had a unicorn to find, a quest to complete. And somewhere along the way, she'd find that unguarded version of Ashen again. She was sure of it.
10. The Price of Prophecy. Ashen stood alone at the edge of the lavender mire, methodically pressing his thumb against the identification pad of his clipboard for the 7th time. The device thrummed with disapproval, the message flashing in regulation font across its surface, request denied, magical contract binding. Dawn mist curled around his boots, lavender-scented tendrils that seemed to mock his increasingly desperate attempts to follow procedure. He exhaled slowly through his nose, the kind of measured breath that had gotten him through 16 years of ranger service and countless magical emergencies. This shouldn't be different. This was just another variable in the field. Except it wasn't. Because the variable was Sely. Ashen tried a different approach, entering the code for emergency relief due to magical compromise. The clipboard's surface rippled, symbols rearranging themselves like water disturbed by a stone before settling on a new message. Query, define nature of compromise. His fingers hovered over the input field. The truth burned in his throat, that he could still feel the ghost of Cely's lips against his, warm and surprisingly soft. That her emotions had flowed through him during their connection, bright and terrifying and beautiful all at once. That he was afraid of what he'd seen in those possible futures, not just death, but the vulnerability that came before it. Ranger emotional state potentially affecting judgment, he finally input, the professional language a shield against the raw bleeding truth. The clipboard processed for a moment, blue light pulsing in what Ashen had always thought of as its thinking pattern. Then it flashed, analysis, proximity spell functioning as intended. Emotional entanglement is predicted outcome. Reassignment denied. Ashen stared at the clipboard, betrayal coursing through him. 16 years of unquestioning service, and this was what he got. The device wasn't finished. It added almost smugly, refer to supplementary reading, field bonds, when magic knows better than protocol. I don't need magical relationship advice from a glorified attendance sheet, Ashen muttered, running his hand through his hair. It was already standing on end, evidence of a night spent staring at the ceiling of their shelter, after Sely had finally fallen asleep, her head tucked against his shoulder. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Valor, propped against a nearby tree, its runes pulsing with unusual steadiness. Usually the sword vibrated with nervous energy, but now it seemed almost calm. If I may, sir, the sword ventured hesitantly, its voice carrying through the morning air. In the great ballad of Ranger Thornheart and the Moon Sprite, it was only after acknowledging his true feelings that he was able to complete his most legendary quest. Ashen glared at the weapon. That's a children's story, not regulation guidance. And stories didn't stop people from getting hurt. From falling too far too fast. From caring when it wasn't safe. He hadn't been trained for this. For her. The best regulations often begin as stories, Valor replied, then immediately dimmed its runes as if shocked by its own boldness. Ashen turned away, unwilling to be lectured by enchanted steel. He needed to focus, to return to camp and maintain the professionalism that had carried him through his career. One momentary lapse in judgment, one kiss, didn't change his duty. Hiking back up the slight incline to where they had made camp, Ashen found Bramble reorganizing their pack with color-coded precision. Small piles of supplies surrounded the halfling, each item tagged with a different colored flag. "Where's Sely?" he asked, noticing her absence immediately. The proximity spell should have alerted him if she'd gone beyond range. A sharp sting in his chest was the standard warning. But something felt off. Like a song missing its harmony. A hum that had gone quiet. There was nothing, just the usual background hum of the enchantment. Bramble didn't look up. She asked me to modify the proximity parameters. Temporary exemption clause, section 4. Said she needed space. Ashen's stomach dropped, a cold, sick feeling spreading outward. That requires ranger authorization. I didn't? He stopped as Bramble finally met his gaze, holding up a scroll bearing his signature. Actually, you did. Last week. Remember that stack of forms you signed when she was trying to befriend those Sprite foxes? Bramble adjusted their glasses with a small, knowing smile. She's very good at planning ahead for someone you call chaotic. She tricked me. Ashen should have been angry, but instead, a reluctant admiration curled through him. Of course she'd found a loophole. That was exactly the kind of thing Sely would do. Panic rose as Ashen scanned the campsite, noticing Sely's pack was gone. The colorful patch-covered bag that seemed to produce an endless supply of snacks, notes, and glittery oddities was nowhere to be seen. Only her notebook remained, open on a flat rock, pages fluttering in the morning breeze. Ashen crossed to it, immediately recognizing Sely's hurried looping script, proving I can finish this myself. No need to protect someone who's too much. Meet you at the cradle. His throat tightened at the words too much, his own words from weeks ago now thrown back at him. Below the message was a precisely drawn map showing her intended route, straight through the most dangerous part of the mire where the emotional residue from yesterday's storm would be strongest. She can't be serious, he muttered, but the evidence was right there, meticulously mapped with surprisingly accurate coordinates. For someone who claimed to hate rules, Sely had a remarkable understanding of navigation. Ashen turned to Glitterhoof, who watched with ancient, knowing eyes from the edge of the clearing. The unicorn had been acting strange since the storm, more alert, less antagonistic. Like it was waiting for something. "The restraining order," Ashen said urgently. "Is it still active?" The unicorn's horn glowed faintly as it tested the magical connection, a network of silvery lines briefly shimmering in the air between them. After a moment Glitterhoof shook his head, mane rippling with concern. The protection spell that had been keeping Sely magically tethered to the unicorn, and by extension to Ashen, was fading. "How long has she been gone?" Ashen demanded, strapping Valor to his side with uncharacteristic haste. The sword hummed with nervous energy, but surprisingly didn't comment. Bramble checked a small jeweled timepiece that hung from a chain around their neck. 3 hours, 17 minutes. They hesitated, then added, "She said not to worry." "She said," another pause before they finished quietly, "she said you'd probably be relieved." The words landed like a physical blow. Relieved. After what they'd shared in that magical shelter? After he'd felt her heart beating against his, after he'd memorized the pattern of freckles across her nose, after he'd finally let himself. Ashen's clipboard chirped with urgent alerts as he began shoving emergency supplies into his pack. Unauthorized solo expedition, protocol violation, submit Form 32B before pursuit. For the first time in his ranger career, Ashen deliberately silenced the device, sliding it into his pack rather than allowing it to hover at his shoulder. Its muffled protests continued as he checked his compass, adjusting the enchanted dial to track magical residue rather than cardinal directions. "She'll trigger the emotional residue mines," Ashen explained tersely to Bramble and Glitterhoof as he laced his boots tighter. "After a tempest like yesterday's, the mire will be saturated with magical emotional traps. Without protection." He couldn't finish the sentence, the image of Sely overwhelmed by concentrated grief or rage too vivid in his mind. He'd seen rangers driven to madness by lesser exposures, experienced rangers with emotional dampening training. And Sely, whose magic responded to her emotions, whose whole being seemed to radiate feeling, she might as well be walking into magical quicksand. "I have to find her," he said, more to himself than the others. Before you go charging off, Bramble said, their voice surprisingly gentle, you should know she's not completely unprepared. They held up a small vial of shimmering purple liquid. She took the emotional buffer potion I made. It won't last forever, but it should give her a few hours of protection. Ashen frowned. When did you? After the hot spring incident, Bramble replied with a shrug. Not all of us rely solely on regulation equipment, Ranger Sourface. As Ashen finished packing, Glitterhoof approached, movements fluid and deliberate. The unicorn had been a reluctant companion at best, alternating between ignoring them completely and actively sabotaging their efforts. Now, though, there was purpose in his steps. With gentle precision, Glitterhoof pressed something into Ashen's palm with his horn, a small knitted figure that resembled Sely, complete with tiny sparkles woven into the yarn. It was simple but perfect, capturing her wild hair and the way she always seemed to be in motion, even when standing still. The unicorn's message flowed directly into Ashen's mind, not in words exactly, but in a clear impression. She doesn't need a protector. She needs someone who sees her worth protecting. Ashen clutched the figure tightly, then tucked it into his breast pocket, directly over his heart. The unicorn was right. Sely had never needed his protection. She'd survived just fine before he came along, causing magical chaos but somehow emerging unscathed. What she needed was someone who understood that her chaos wasn't a flaw to be managed. Without another word, Ashen strode into the mire, leaving the path and protocol behind. His focus was entirely on finding Sely before the lingering storm magic did. The lavender mire lived up to its name. Everything from the mist to the water to the very air seemed infused with the herb's scent. Under normal circumstances it would be pleasant, even calming. But after a magical storm, that same scent carried dangerous emotional resonance. Ashen felt the first emotional trap almost immediately, a pocket of concentrated melancholy that hit him like a physical weight. Standard Ranger training taught him to focus on something solid and real, to anchor himself against the magical influence. He reached into his pocket, fingers finding the small knitted Sely as he pushed through the effect. The mire grew thicker as he advanced, muddy ground giving way to deeper pools of purplish water. Sely's path, according to her map, cut straight through the center, the fastest route but also the most treacherous. Trust her to choose efficiency over safety. Sely, he called out, voice echoing strangely in the mist. Celie Rosehill. No answer came, but Ashen's proximity charm gave a faint responding pulse. She was within range, but barely. The modified spell was stretching to its limits. Another emotional trap loomed ahead, this one shimmering with a reddish hue that marked anger. Ashen detoured around it, losing precious time but unwilling to risk the mental contamination. If he was going to help Sely, he needed a clear head. As he navigated deeper into the mire, Ashen found himself in an area where the mist formed strange swirling patterns, almost like words if viewed from the right angle. This was old magic, the kind that predated the Bureau and its regulations. The kind that responded to intent rather than procedure. A faint noise up ahead caught his attention, not Sely's voice, but a sound he recognized all too well from his ranger training, the distinctive crackle of an emotional resonance mine discharging. Ashen broke into a run, splashing through shallow pools and barely avoiding tangling vines. The landscape blurred around him, his focus narrowed to that sound and the direction it had come from. If Sely had triggered a full mine, not just a residual trap. He burst into a small clearing where the mist hung so thick it was like a curtain. Through it he could just make out a figure kneeling on a small island of relatively dry land, surrounded by a crackling dome of magical energy, a resonance mine fully activated with Sely at its center. "Sely," he shouted, moving toward her without thought. She looked up, her face visible through the shimmering energy field. The usual sparkle in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull weariness that made Ashen's chest ache. The mine was feeding on her emotions, amplifying whatever negative feelings she brought with her. "Stay back," she called, her voice muffled by the magical barrier. "It's keyed to me now. If you try to cross, it'll just—" "I know how resonance mines work," Ashen interrupted, stopping at the edge of the energy field. He'd dealt with these before, but usually with a full ranger team and containment equipment. They worked by locking onto the first emotional signature they detected, then feeding on those emotions until they either burnt themselves out or, well, the other outcome wasn't something he wanted to consider. "Can you stand?" he asked, assessing the situation with practiced efficiency. The mind's energy was flickering slightly, a good sign. But it wasn't just draining her. It was mirroring her. And if she gave in, she might not come back. It just wasn't fully established yet.
11. The Cradle of Echoes. Twilight bathed the Cradle of Echoes in deepening blue light as Sely approached. The ancient site resembled a natural amphitheater, concentric rings of white stone descending to a central platform where crystalline spires rose like frozen fountains. Each step she took echoed unnaturally, as if multiple versions of herself were walking alongside her invisible. "Well, that's not creepy at all," she muttered, trying to lighten her own spirits. The sight was even more breathtaking than the sketches in her research journals had suggested. Under different circumstances, she would have been bouncing with excitement, notebook out, documenting every magical resonance and architectural wonder. Now the grandeur only made her feel smaller. Cely's determined expression faltered only briefly as she reached the outer ring. Her pack felt impossibly heavy. She'd been walking for hours through the lavender mire, dodging patches of emotional residue that manifested as color-shifting mist. A particularly nasty cloud of rejection memory had caught her sleeve, leaving a temporary burn in the shape of a handprint. She glanced down at the mark, its edges still pulsing with dull purple light. It stung, but not as much as the real thing had. Ashen's face when he'd pulled away that morning in their shelter, the careful way he'd reconstructed his walls, that had been the real burn. "I can finish this alone," she whispered to herself, the cradle immediately picking up her words and returning them as overlapping echoes. Alone, I finish." The effect was unsettling, her own voice coming back fragmented and multiplied. She squared her shoulders and continued downward, each ring growing colder beneath her bare feet. "Okay, vocally processing my feelings is off the table," she mumbled. A chorus of "table feelings off" answered her. Great. Even the magical ruins were mocking her now. The central platform pulsed with soft light when she stepped onto it. Sely unpacked her ritual supplies with shaking hands, silver thread, unicorn hair, collected from Glitterhoof's knitting corner, dried lavender, and her notebook open to the release ritual she'd been carefully developing. "A proper magical creature liaison sees things through," she told the empty cradle. Through sees things," the cradle replied, its echoes sounding almost curious now. Her hands trembled as she arranged the components. This ritual represented everything she'd worked for. Her chance to prove she wasn't just chaos in human form. That her approach to magical creatures wasn't wrong, just because it didn't involve restraints and regulations. She thought of Ashen's clipboard and its endless lists of infractions. Would he add this to her file? Unauthorized ritual performance. Unicorn release without supervision. Abandoning escort protection. The thought almost made her smile despite everything. The ritual began simply enough. Sely arranged the components in a circular pattern, chanting words taught to her by the stewards at the stitching circle. The crystal spires responded immediately, humming at different pitches that harmonized with her voice. So far, exactly as planned. "Bonds of ancient making, threads of destiny unwoven," she chanted, her voice growing stronger as the ritual's energy began to flow. "Release what was errantly bound, restore what was freely chosen." The silver thread began to glow, twining around the unicorn hairs like living vines seeking sunlight. The lavender released its scent, amplified 100-fold by the cradle's acoustics until the air seemed saturated with purple. Cely's confidence grew. She could do this. She would finish what she started, properly and without disaster. As the chant deepened, the air around Sely shimmered. Reflected in each crystal spire she saw not her current self but possibilities. Sely with eyes glowing with uncontrolled power, Sely with hands wrapped in fate threads, controlling hundreds of magical creatures. Sely alone and diminished, magic burned out completely. That's not me, she insisted, but the cradle only echoed, me not me, me not me. Focus, she told herself firmly, trying not to look at the disturbing reflections. The central part of the ritual required complete concentration. Drawing Glitterhoof's bond away from the restraining order, and into the silver thread, where it could be gently dissolved. She was 3 syllables from completion, when everything went wrong. A sudden surge of energy shot from the central platform, startling Sely mid-chant. The release ritual intended for Glitterhoof warped, the silver thread flying from the circle to wrap around her wrists instead. No, that's wrong, she gasped, trying to pull free. The thread tightened, beginning to sink into her skin like liquid silver. Stop it, she cried, looking frantically around for what had triggered the change. Had she mispronounced something? Used the wrong inflection? The panic rising in her chest made it hard to think. The thread continued sinking into her skin, leaving gleaming silver traces beneath the surface like magical tattoos. It didn't hurt exactly, but the sensation of something foreign becoming part of her was deeply unsettling. The crystal spires flashed with blinding light, and Sely found herself momentarily in the stitching circle, witnessing a memory. Young Glitterhoof refusing the fate loom, cutting threads, other unicorns watching in horror. The last weaver must always be bound to something, voices whispered. If not to duty, then to a soul. With sickening clarity, Sely realized the ritual wasn't releasing Glitterhoof. It's binding the unicorn to her instead. No. The horror of it struck her like a physical blow. That's not what I wanted. I was trying to free her, not. But the ritual had its own momentum now, fed by centuries of magical tradition and the cradle's ancient purpose. The silver markings on her skin began to pulse, forming intricate patterns that matched the concentric rings of the cradle itself. She could feel Glitterhoof's presence even though the unicorn wasn't physically there. A reluctant awareness stretching between them like an invisible tether. Stop! Sely cried, fighting against the ritual's momentum. The silver threads paused but didn't retreat. The cradle offered an alternative, visions appearing in the crystals of Sely using this bond to do remarkable things, healing magical creatures, restoring lost enchantments, becoming a legend herself. All she had to do is accept. She saw herself surrounded by unicorns, their horns bowing to her in deference. Saw magical creatures flocking to her call, their ailments healing under her touch. Saw her name in magical history books, respected and revered. No more being the walking disaster, the chaos agent, the girl who couldn't control her own magic. No more flinching at her own reflection. No more being told she was too much, or not enough, or never the right kind of magic. For one tempting moment, Sely considered it. To never be overlooked again. To prove her worth beyond doubt. Then she remembered Glitterhoof's words about choices and freedom. No, she said firmly. The whole point was to free the unicorn, not create another chain. The cradle's energy pulsed with disappointment, the crystals darkening. I won't do it, she insisted, her voice growing stronger. Power without choice isn't freedom, it's just another kind of cage. Find someone else for your destiny weaving. The cradle's response was immediate and terrifying. The silver threads that had been mapping themselves onto her skin suddenly contracted, squeezing so tight she could barely breathe. Images flashed across the crystals, showing the consequences of her refusal, magic unraveling, creatures losing their connection to the world, enchantments failing. I'll finish the ritual properly, Sely insisted, even as the spires began to drain her own magical essence instead, feeding on her intent. The silver threads withdrew from her wrists only to reappear around her ankles, her waist, her throat, not binding Glitterhoof to her, but binding her to the cradle itself. A sacrifice is required, the echoes whispered. Someone must take the burden. Wait, that wasn't in the literature, she protested weakly, her knees buckling as the drain intensified. She fell to the platform, her palms scraping against the cold stone. The cold crept into her bones. Not just cold, emptiness. Like the cradle was hollowing her out to make space for something ancient and endless. The unicorn thread was supposed to disperse, not transfer. The cradle didn't care about her research. Magical nexuses rarely did. They operated on older, deeper rules than those written in any book. The silver threads tightened further, drawing out her strength, her magic, her very essence. Sacrifice, sacrifice, the cradle insisted, its echoes growing more urgent. Maintain balance, maintain. Cely's breathing came in shallow gasps as the ritual consumed her. She'd been so determined to prove herself, to show she could handle magic properly without supervision. Now she was facing the consequences of that hubris. As twilight deepened to true night, Cely's form began to fade at the edges, her magic being absorbed into the ancient nexus. Tears streamed down her face, but her expression remained resolute. "At least I got to be part of something important," she whispered, thinking of Ashen and what might have been. She thought about their moments in the magical shelter during the storm. His guard finally lowered, the gentleness in his touch, the way his eyes had softened when she told a particularly terrible joke. She thought about the brief, perfect kiss they'd shared, and how quickly he'd rebuilt his walls afterward. Would he miss her? Would he even notice she was gone? Or would she just become another file in his archives, another mission gone wrong? She closed her eyes as the silver threads pulled tighter, drawing her deeper into the magical ether. Her last conscious thought was regret that she'd never know if he would have returned to her. "Sely." The voice barely penetrated her fading awareness. She was so tired. So very tired. "Sely." The voice again, closer now. Desperate. Familiar. Something slammed into the cradle's energy field, a disruption so violent it sent shockwaves through the entire structure. The silver threads faltered in their consumption, momentarily loosening. Sely managed to crack open one eye. A figure stood at the edge of the central platform, silhouetted against the night sky, one hand outstretched as if he'd physically struck the invisible barrier. Even through her blurred vision, she recognized him immediately. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Just stared, his hands clenched at his sides like if he blinked she might vanish. "Ashen." Her voice was barely a whisper. The ranger looked wild, nothing like his usual composed self. His uniform was torn in places, smudged with what looked like lavender mud and something that glowed faintly green. His hair stood nearly on end, and his eyes, those always controlled, always professional eyes, blazed with frantic intensity. "What did you do?" he shouted, slamming his fist against the barrier again. "Sely, what did you do?" "Tried to fix things," she mumbled through numb lips. "Going not great." The cradle seemed confused by the interruption, its echoes fragmenting Ashen's voice into dozens of overlapping shouts. The silver threads around Cely's body pulsed erratically, unsure whether to continue their work or respond to the new threat. "Let her go." Ashen was pulling something from his belt now, his enchanted compass, the one that always pointed toward magical disturbances. He slammed it against the barrier, and the device shattered, releasing a burst of pure ranger magic. The barrier flickered. Weakened. Held. "You can't break cradle magic," Sely managed to call out. "It's linked to the foundation of creation. Just go." "I made this choice." "The hell you did." Ashen looked furious now. "You didn't choose to be consumed by an ancient magical trap. The unicorn warned me." "Glitterhoof?" Cely's fading attention sharpened slightly. "She told you?" "She told me enough." Ashen was pacing the edge of the barrier now, looking for any weakness. Something about threads and weavers, and his face twisted with frustration. "It doesn't matter. I'm getting you out." The cradle responded to his determination with a surge of power, tightening its hold on Sely once more. She cried out as the silver threads dug deeper, drawing more of her essence into the nexus. "Ashen, please," she begged. "Just go. It wants a weaver. It needs someone to maintain balance. Better me than forcing Glitterhoof back." Through rapidly dimming vision, she saw his expression change. The fury drained away, replaced by something she'd never seen on his face before, pure naked fear. "No," he said, his voice dropping to something raw and broken. "He'd left once. He wouldn't survive doing it again. Not you, Sely." Not after everything. Not when he stopped, swallowed hard. I'm not leaving without you. Rules be damned. He stepped back from the barrier, something clearly crystallizing in his mind. Then, to Celie's horror, he began unbuckling his ranger belt, the enchanted one that marked his authority and protected him from magical intrusion. "What are you doing?" she cried. Ashen didn't answer. Instead, he unclipped his magical clipboard and tossed it aside. It landed with a clatter, pages instantly fluttering open, red warnings blinking across its surface. "Protocol violation," intoned the clipboard. "Protection equipment removal in magical hazard zone. Site code 552B. "Shut up," Ashen growled at it, continuing to strip away his magical protections. Last to go was the silver pin that marked his ranger status, which he unpinned with deliberate care before setting it gently on the ground. The cradle's echoes had fallen silent, as if it too was watching this unexpected development with curiosity. "Ashen." Celie's voice was barely audible now. "Don't." "Ranger Ward isn't here anymore," he said quietly. "Just Ashen. And I'm making a choice." He looked directly at her, his storm gray eyes clear and determined. "If the cradle wants someone, it can have me instead." The cradle pulsed once, acknowledgement or challenge she couldn't tell. And the silver threads turned toward him.
12. Don't let go. Ashen's heart hammered against his ribs as he raced down the ancient stone steps of the Cradle of Echoes, each footfall multiplying into a thunderous chorus against the curved walls. Too many heartbeats since he'd seen Sely vanish into this place alone. Too many minutes wasted on protocol when he should have trusted his instincts from the beginning. The amphitheater below pulsed with unstable magical energy, sending waves of disorienting echoes that made his trained senses swim. Crystalline spires ringed the central platform, their surfaces flickering with hungry light. And there, suspended several inches above the stonework, hung Sely. His breath caught. She floated in midair, partially transparent and wrapped in pulsing silver threads that seemed to be drawing her very essence into the crystal spires. Already he could see through parts of her, as if she were becoming nothing more than memory. His ranger-trained mind automatically catalogued the situation. Class 5 magical vortex, regulatory response time exceeded, probability of extraction without penalty. His clipboard vibrated violently inside his pack, no doubt flooding with urgent alerts and violation notices. Proper procedure would be to establish a containment perimeter, summon a ritual interruption specialist, and absolutely not cross the clearly visible echo field that separated the steps from the platform. Ashen ignored it all. With a single practiced glance, he calculated the pattern of the echo field, noted its pulse rate, and deliberately stepped into it, instantly violating the first and most sacred rule of magical crisis response. The moment his boot crossed the threshold, the echoes attacked. They rose from the crystal-like smoke, coalescing into phantom versions of himself. Each one different yet the same. Ashen failing to save former colleagues during a leyline rupture, Ashen following regulations that had led to a magical creature's suffering, Ashen turning away from Sely that morning at the Lavender Mire, fear winning over heart. Protocol dictates neutrality in all magical engagements, one echo intoned in his voice. Safety requires emotional distance from subjects, stated another, circling him like a predator. Attachment compromises judgment, a third phantom declared, wearing his face with a cold expression he'd practiced for years. The cacophony of his own rigid beliefs surrounded him, each phrase he'd repeated like scripture throughout his career now thrown back at him. Ashen pushed forward, gritting his teeth as the echo field tried to overwhelm him with his own logic. "You're wrong," he told the phantoms, surprised at the certainty in his voice. He moved closer to the platform, each step harder than the last as the magical resistance thickened. His joints ached with the effort, but he kept his eyes locked on Sely's suspended form. As he pushed through another layer of resistance, her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and distant. "Ashen?" Her voice was faint, almost part of the echo itself. The silver threads tightened visibly, pulling more of her essence away with each pulse. You shouldn't be here. There are rules. Despite everything, she attempted a smile that absolutely broke his heart. I was trying to prove I could do something right, she whispered. Something by the book. I've been wrong, Ashen said, his voice cutting through the echoes with surprising strength. He reached out despite the warning flare of magic that instantly burned his outstretched hand, leaving angry red welts across his palm. Not you. Never you. The crystal spires shrieked in protest at his advance, sending shards of memory light that sliced across his ranger uniform. Where they cut, the fabric tore away to reveal glimpses of his past beneath. Each failure, each moment when following rules had cost something precious. His sleeve ripped to expose the scar from a mission gone wrong. His collar tore to reveal the medallion he kept hidden, a reminder of someone he couldn't save. The cradle shifted tactics, drawing deeper from his mind. A perfect illusion of Sely materialized beside him, but not his Sely. This version stood regulation perfect, her wild curls tamed and tied back, her movements measured and precise, all her spontaneous energy subdued into perfect control. This is what you wanted, the echoes whispered from all sides. Order. Compliance. Safety. Ashen looked between the fading real Sely, still partly herself even as she disappeared, and this hollow perfect version. His expression cleared with sudden, absolute certainty. I was afraid, he confessed, taking another step toward Sely despite the increasing magical resistance that pressed against him like a physical wall. The pressure made his ears pop and muscles strain. Not of your chaos, but of what it showed me about myself. That I've been hiding behind regulations, because feeling anything meant risking everything. The silver threads around Sely flickered momentarily, responding to his emotional truth. Every form I've filled out, every rule I've enforced, he pushed through another layer of resistance, grunting with the effort, was just a way to pretend I had control. He was close enough now to see tears tracking down her translucent cheeks, catching the light of the crystals as they fell through her increasingly insubstantial form. You break every rule I've ever followed, and Ashen's voice grew stronger, more certain with each word. I've been falling for you since you stuck that ridiculous glitter sticker on my citation scroll. The crystal spires vibrated in dangerous harmony, focusing their energy directly at him. The echo field compressed, squeezing his chest until each breath became a battle. She belongs to the cradle now, the crystals echoed in a chorus that rattled his bones. The price must be paid. The last weaver must be bound or released through sacrifice. The silver threads around Sely pulsed brighter, drawing her further into transparency. Ashen felt his own strength beginning to fade as the cradle began draining him too, thin silver filaments reaching from the stones beneath his feet to wrap around his ankles. No, Ashen stated with absolute conviction, the word carrying more force than any spell he'd ever cast. She doesn't belong to anything or anyone, not to duty, not to prophecy, not even to me. He drew valor from its sheath, the talking sword humming with unexpected clarity instead of its usual anxious vibration. I've got your back this time, Valor said, its voice steady. No fainting, I promise. Bonds that matter are chosen, not assigned, Ashen declared. With a precise movement that would make any ranger instructor proud, he sliced through the nearest silver thread binding Sely. The thread snapped with a musical tone that hung in the air, but to his horror, the severed ends immediately began reaching toward each other, reforming the connection. Ashen realized that physical force alone couldn't break this magic. This was old magic, emotion magic, the kind rangers were specifically trained to resist and contain, never engage with. The kind Sely understood instinctively. Sely, he called, his voice gentling despite the magical tempest surrounding them. I choose you. Not because I'm assigned to protect you. Not because of proximity spells or bureau regulations. He reached for her again, his heart sinking as his hand passed through her increasingly insubstantial form. Because you make me want to break every rule for the right reasons. Their eyes locked, and in that moment of pure connection, Ashen did the most non-regulation thing possible. He leaned forward and kissed her fading form. For one terrifying heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the contact created an immediate magical reaction, a surge of golden light that emanated from the point where their lips met. It spread outward in concentric circles, washing over the crystal spires and stone steps in waves of warmth. The silver threads dissolved into shimmering dust as Sely became solid again beneath his touch, her arms wrapping around him as the kiss deepened. Tiny golden blooms unfurled in the cracks between the stones, just like they had under the storm shelter. A different kind of magic, born of choice, not prophecy. The crystal spires ceased their hungry draining, instead beginning to chime in harmonious approval. The echoes of his past selves faded, replaced by a single resonance that felt right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Cely's eyes were bright with returned life and something more. Her fingers traced his jawline with wonder, as if making sure he was real. "You broke protocol," she whispered, voice tinged with awe. Ashen's smile, his first genuine, unguarded smile since she'd known him, transformed his face as he held her close. "Some rules are meant to be broken," he replied, as the cradle of echoes filled with warm, approving light that encircled them both. Behind them, a distinct snort echoed through the chamber. Ashen turned to find Glitterhoof standing at the edge of the platform, the unicorn's expression as judgmental as ever, but there was something new there too. A grudging respect, perhaps. "It's about time," the unicorn communicated telepathically, its mental voice dripping with sarcasm. "I was starting to think I'd be stuck with you two forever. Does this mean my restraining order is lifted?" Sely asked hopefully, still nestled in Ashen's arms. Glitterhoof pawed the stone floor, leaving small sparks of magical energy in its wake. "The cradle recognizes your bond. It supersedes the restriction. So that's a yes." Sely pressed. The unicorn huffed dramatically. "Yes, the restraining order is dissolved. But," it fixed Ashen with a stern glare, "if she tries another unauthorized rescue mission, she's your problem now, Ranger." "I can live with that," Ashen said, surprising even himself with how much he meant it. The ground beneath them shuddered suddenly, the stones rearranging themselves as the ancient magic of the cradle shifted. The crystal spires began to retract into the floor, their light dimming to a gentle glow. "What's happening?" Ashen asked, instantly alert, one arm still protectively around Sely. "The cradle is releasing the binding magic," Glitterhoof explained, seeming almost impressed. "It's resetting the fate threads." Sely gasped. "But what about your role? Your duty as the last weaver?" The unicorn tilted its magnificent head, the spiral horn catching the fading light. "That title no longer applies. I am simply Glitterhoof now." "Simply," Sely repeated with a small laugh. "As simple as any immortal magical being can be," the unicorn conceded with what almost appeared to be a smile. "The cradle recognized another kind of magic tonight. One stronger than duty or prophecy." Ashen felt heat rise to his face as both Sely and Glitterhoof turned to look at him. "I just followed my instincts," he mumbled, the old habit of deflection still strong. "Your instincts," Sely repeated softly, touching his cheek. "Not your regulations?" He covered her hand with his own, the burned palm still stinging where magical backlash had struck him. "Maybe it's time I learned to trust them more." The last of the crystal spires disappeared into the floor with a final musical chime, leaving the cradle of echoes looking like an ordinary, if ancient stone amphitheater. The oppressive magical pressure had vanished, replaced by a peaceful stillness. Valor cleared its throat from where Ashen had sheathed it. "Not to interrupt this very touching moment, but I believe I performed admirably under pressure, and would like that noted in the official record." Ashen laughed, actually laughed, the sound echoing around them in a way that held no menace. "Consider it logged," he said, patting the sword's hilt. "So," Sely said, her eyes twinkling with familiar mischief as she looked up at him. "What exactly does the Ranger handbook say about kissing magical incident perpetrators?" "Strictly prohibited," Ashen replied seriously, then bent to kiss her again. "But I'm considering a career change anyway." As their lips met again, gentler this time but no less profound, Ashen felt something inside him settle into place, something that had been restless and searching for longer than he cared to admit. The clipboard in his pack had gone silent, the violations unlogged, the protocols unheeded. And for the first time in his career as a ranger, Ashen Ward didn't care one bit about the rules. Sely grinned against his shoulder. Good. Because I brought the glitter.
13. Glitterhoof's final grievance. Sely squinted as morning sunlight filtered through the ancient trees surrounding the cradle of echoes. She, Ashen, and Glitterhoof ascended the last ring of stone steps, with a new lightness to their movements, as if the weight of prophecy and danger had finally lifted from their shoulders. Her hand occasionally brushed against Ashen's, each touch sending small sparkles of residual magic dancing between their fingers. She still wasn't used to seeing him without his clipboard hovering at his shoulder. He deliberately packed it away after the ritual, tucking it into his bag with a decisiveness that had made her heart flutter. The absence of that perpetually judging magical object somehow made him look taller, less burdened. So, Sely said, breaking the comfortable silence, technically we completed the escort mission, right? The unicorn made it to the cradle of echoes without being, magically exploited or poached or whatever. She glanced at Glitterhoof, who walked a few paces ahead, silver mane catching the dappled sunlight. The unicorn's restraining order scroll still floated nearby, but its glow had dimmed considerably. Technically, Ashen agreed, his tone lighter than she'd ever heard it, though I'm certain my final report will require several appendices to explain the numerous protocol violations. His hand deliberately captured hers, and instead of pulling away, he interlaced their fingers. Sely beamed up at him, her magic responding with a small puff of glitter that made him sneeze, but notably not pull away. Progress. Definite progress. I think the Bureau's going to need a whole new classification system just for our mission, she said, swinging their joined hands slightly. Something between catastrophic magical incident and surprising success against all regulations. Ashen's lips quirked in that almost smile that she'd come to treasure. I believe that classification already exists. It's called the Celie Rosehill effect. Ooh, I like that. Do I get a special badge? Or maybe my own warning sign? I think you are your own warning sign, he replied, but the words carried no sting, just warmth. They reached the edge of the forest, where a small, clear pond reflected the morning sky like a mirror. Bramble was already there, meticulously cataloging their journey on a set of color-coded scrolls. The halfling looked up, adjusting their thick glasses. You're approximately 74 minutes later than the projected arrival time, they announced, then added with uncharacteristic softness. But you're both glowing, so I assume it was worth it. Sely felt heat rush to her cheeks. Glowing? I mean, there was that whole ritual light show, and maybe some residual magic, but... Not magical glowing, Bramble interrupted, their expression knowing. The other kind. Before Sely could respond, Valor strapped to Ashen's back suddenly sprang to life. Behold, the sword announced in a booming voice that startled nearby birds into flight. The triumph of the noble ranger and his chaotic companion. Let me sing the ballad of the cradle's choice. The blade began vibrating intensely, emitting what could only be described as enthusiastic but painfully off-key musical notes. Is there an off switch? Sely whispered to Ashen, who looked mortified as Valor launched into a highly embellished verse about eyes like stormy skies and hair that sparkles with magical defiance. Ashen attempted to sheathe the sword, but it continued singing from inside its scabbard, the muffled poetry somehow even more dramatic. When Stormheart met the Sparkle Soul, the cradle wept with joy, sang Valor through the leather. Two halves made whole beneath the ancient stars. I knew I shouldn't have let it read my poetry scrolls, Sely muttered, hiding her face in Ashen's shoulder. The warmth of his body against her cheek still felt like a small miracle. After everything, the fight, the ritual, nearly dissolving into the magical ether, being able to just lean against him like this felt impossibly precious. Bramble cleared their throat. If we could focus on completing the documentation? There are 17 separate forms requiring immediate attention, not counting the incident reports for the, they consulted their notes, magical bed mishap, truth steam exposure, and whatever happened with those luminescent beetle sprites. Can't we just enjoy the moment for 5 minutes? Sely pleaded. Look at this place. She gestured around at the sunlit clearing, the crystal-clear pond, the remains of ancient unicorn magic shimmering in the morning air. We just saved Glitterhoof, prevented a magical catastrophe, and nobody died. I think that deserves at least a breakfast break before paperwork. Glitterhoof, who had been maintaining a dignified distance throughout the journey back, finally approached. The unicorn's galaxy eyes fixed on Sely with an unreadable expression. For a moment nobody moved, even Valor fell silent in anticipation. Then, with deliberate precision, Glitterhoof lowered his horn to the floating restraining order scroll. I suppose, the unicorn's voice resonated directly in Sely's mind, dry as autumn leaves, that anyone willing to dissolve into magical particles rather than force a bond has earned a measure of respect. The horn pierced the scroll, which split cleanly in half before dissolving into a shower of silver sparkles. You're slightly less insufferable now. Sely's laughter bubbled up, bright and unrestrained. That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. She reached out instinctively toward the unicorn, then caught herself remembering boundaries. To her surprise, Glitterhoof stepped forward, allowing her hand to rest briefly on his neck. The touch created a soft glow where their energies met, not a binding, but a connection freely given. She felt a lump rise in her throat. After all this time chasing the unicorn, trying to convince him she wasn't a threat, here he was, trusting her. Choosing to connect with her. The moment felt weightier than any magical binding could have been. Thank you, she whispered. For trusting me. And for not skewering me that first day in the glade, when you totally could have. It was tempting, Glitterhoof admitted, the mental voice tinged with what might have been amusement. The moment was broken when Glitterhoof suddenly gave Sely an affectionate, but forceful headbutt that sent her stumbling backward directly into the pond. She surfaced with a spluttering gasp, hair plastered to her face and water streaming from her clothes. I deserve that too, she admitted, grinning up at the unicorn, who made a sound suspiciously like a chuckle. Ashen rushed to the pond's edge, his ranger instincts clearly warring between proper protocol and his newfound willingness to break rules. Are you all right? I'm fantastic, Sely declared, splashing around before swimming toward him. The water's perfect. You should come in. A flash of alarm crossed his face. That's not, I don't think. Fine, stay dry and dignified, she teased, reaching the edge where he stood. She extended her hand, and when he reached down to help her out, she grinned mischievously. Ashen's eyes narrowed. Don't you dare. Too late. She gave his arm a firm tug, using his own momentum to pull him headfirst into the pond. He surfaced with a shocked gasp, his usually perfect hair flattened against his head, water dripping from his nose. Celie Rosehill, he sputtered, that was entirely magical, she suggested, swimming closer to him. Childish, he corrected, but there was no heat in it. Instead, a slow, troubling smile spread across his face. And deserving of appropriate response. Before she could react, he initiated the most perfectly executed water splash she'd ever experienced, probably applying some ranger physics calculation to achieve maximum soaking impact. That's against the rules, she laughed, retaliating with her own splash. I've recently reconsidered my position on rules, Ashen replied, catching her wrist gently before she could splash him again. The touch shifted the mood instantly, water droplets between them sparkling with tiny hints of magic. Ashen helped her from the water, not even flinching when her soaked form pressed against his formerly immaculate uniform. What happens now? He asked quietly, for her ears only. The question carried weight beyond their immediate circumstances. Sely looked around at their unlikely company. A regulation-breaking ranger, a reluctantly fond unicorn, an overly dramatic sword, and a meticulous halfling cartographer. Each face represented something she'd never truly had before, belonging. I don't know, she answered honestly. My specialty has always been creating magical disasters, not planning what comes after them. That's not entirely true, Ashen said, tucking a wet strand of hair behind her ear. You create connections. That's what you did with Glitterhoof, with Bramble, with me. The simple honesty in his words made her breath catch. Do you regret it? Getting assigned to my case? All the trouble and near-death experiences? His eyes, those storm gray eyes that had once seemed so cold, crinkled at the corners. Not for a moment. Though I wouldn't mind if our next adventure involved fewer restraining orders and prophecies. Next adventure? Celie repeated, her heart doing a little skip. So you're not heading back to the bureau to request reassignment to someone less magical, chaotic, prone to causing enchanted disasters? His expression softened. Why would I want that? I've spent my entire career following rules, containing magic, keeping everything in its proper place. And then you showed me that sometimes magic doesn't need to be contained, it needs to be connected. As if reading her thoughts, Glitterhoof approached again, this time standing beside rather than in front of her. The last weaver walks where she chooses, the unicorn projected to the group, though his galaxy eyes rested on Sely. Perhaps, occasionally, with company. A small knitted charm materialized from nowhere and dropped into Cely's palm, a perfect miniature of herself and Ashen standing side by side. Cely's eyes filled with tears as she took Ashen's hand again. Did you just acknowledge that you like us? She asked the unicorn, unable to keep the delight from her voice. I acknowledged that I no longer find your presence entirely objectionable, Glitterhoof corrected, but there was definite warmth in the mental voice. Bramble approached, clutching their scrolls in one hand and extracting a small dried flower from their pack with the other. For the record, they said formally, this expedition has proven most educational. I would not be opposed to further collaboration, provided future adventures include proper meal scheduling and fewer emotional enchantments. They handed the dried flower to Sely. Lavender, they explained. From the mire. I thought perhaps you might wish to preserve a reminder of significant moments. Sely clutched the flower gently, recognizing it from near where she and Ashen had sheltered during the storm, where they'd first kissed. Thank you, Bramble, she whispered. Behold the binding of souls through shared peril. Valor suddenly announced from the scabbard, making them all jump. The halfling presents a token of fellowship. The unicorn offers knitted blessings. Truly this is the stuff of legends. Is there a mute option? Ashen sighed, patting the scabbard apologetically. I think it's sweet, Sely said, falling into step beside Glitterhoof rather than behind. The unicorn allowed this new arrangement without comment, though a small satisfied smile played at the corners of his expressive mouth. Loud but sweet. She squeezed Ashen's hand, feeling the lingering magic of the cradle humming between them, a bond chosen not imposed. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone anymore. She had an irritable unicorn, a perfectionist halfling, an overenthusiastic sword, and a ranger who'd chosen chaos over order. As they walked together toward the path leading away from the cradle, Sely felt a lightness she hadn't known in years. For once her magic wasn't leaking out in chaotic bursts, it flowed smoothly, contentedly, creating small sparkles that danced around the group like a blessing. I warn you, Glitterhoof projected, though there was unmistakable fondness in the tone, I have an extensive list of rules for travel companions. Rule 1: no singing. I take grave exception, Valor began. Rule 2, Ashen added smoothly, no unsolicited poetry before breakfast. Rule 3, Bramble contributed, scheduled meal times are non-negotiable. Sely laughed, the sound carrying across the clearing. And Rule 4, she added, occasional magical disasters are to be expected and forgiven. Within reason, the others replied in unison, and the shared laughter that followed felt like the beginning of something new and wonderful.
14. Field report failure. Ashen stared at the door to the ranger outpost, key hovering near the lock. After weeks of magical mishaps, near-death experiences, and one particularly memorable unicorn-induced clothing disaster, the familiar sight of his meticulously maintained station should have felt like coming home. Instead, he hesitated. Are you planning to unlock it, or shall we simply admire the craftsmanship of the door until nightfall? Valor piped up from where it was strapped to his back. Ashen sighed and inserted the key. The enchanted lock recognized his magical signature and clicked open with a satisfied hum, the door swinging inward to reveal exactly what he expected, everything precisely as he'd left it. Books arranged by subject and author on the shelves. Field guides stacked by region and magical density. His spare uniform hung with mathematical precision from the coat rack. Not a speck of dust. Not a single item out of place. Not a hint that anything had changed. Except everything had. Home Suite Regulation Approved Domicile. Valor announced, vibrating with excitement as Ashen unstrapped the sword and propped it carefully in the corner. Though it's a bit quiet, isn't it? Perhaps I could provide some ambiance. Before Ashen could object, the sword began humming, a slow melancholic tune that echoed through the pristine space. Oddly, Ashen didn't feel compelled to silence it. The mournful melody matched something hollow inside his chest as he surveyed his quarters. Sterile. That was the word. The outpost had always been orderly, he'd taken pride in that fact. But now it looked sterile. Lifeless. As if something essential was missing. He knew exactly what, or rather who, that something was. Ashen moved mechanically to his desk, removing his field pack and extracting his notes. Protocol demanded a comprehensive report upon mission completion. 26 years of ranger training had instilled in him the sacred nature of paperwork, the beauty of properly documented incidents, the poetry of accurately cited regulation violations. He pulled a fresh sheet of regulation parchment from the drawer and reached for his quill. Through the open window, a burst of laughter caught his attention. His eyes darted to the source. Sely knelt in the small herb garden behind the outpost, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, completely covered in dirt. Her hair was partially escaping its tie, dark curls framing her face as she leaned over a cluster of miniature mandrakes. The temperamental plants usually retreated at the slightest disturbance, but they seemed almost happy as Sely spoke to them. One tiny mandrake had wrapped its leafy tendrils around her finger, holding on like a child. Now see, that wasn't so bad, was it? Sely's voice drifted through the window. New soil, fresh start. No judgment about your root system from me. The mandrake squeaked something in response that made her laugh again. The sound traveled through the air and settled somewhere in Ashen's chest, warm and bright. He turned back to the parchment, dipped his quill, and began writing. Assignment completion report. Case file 437B, he started, the familiar bureaucratic rhythm almost comforting. Then he paused, looking up again to catch Sely gently entangling herself from the clingy mandrake. After a moment's hesitation, he continued, Unicorn escort successfully completed with only minor magical catastrophes, one near dissolution of reality, approximately 7,000 regulation violations, and the unexpected discovery that chaos is occasionally preferable to order. Ashen stared at the words. They were not regulation-approved phrasing. They were distinctly personal. Subjective. He should strike them out, and begin again with proper bureau terminology. Instead, he dipped his quill and continued writing. Subject Celie Rosehill first encountered by reporting officer on the 17th of Mistfall, following an unauthorized unicorn summoning incident. Initial assessment classified subject as high-risk magical hazard, requiring containment and supervision. This assessment proved simultaneously correct and woefully inadequate. The words flowed with surprising ease. Ashen wrote of the Wayward Hollow and its truth steam, clinically noting how the enchanted room had responded to unacknowledged emotional states, rather than spoken preferences. He documented the exact magical frequency of the storm in Lavender Mire, accompanied by a precise account of the shelter spell they'd cast together. Subject's unique affinity for emotional resonance magic created an unexpected synchronicity with reporting officers' field stabilization spells, resulting in a protective enchantment of unusual strength and comfort. He paused, quill hovering above the parchment. Comfort wasn't a technical term. Neither was the word that had almost followed it, intimacy. Outside, Sely had finished with the mandrakes and was now attempting to rinse her hands with a small water spell. It was going poorly. The stream kept arcing away from her at the last second, splashing everywhere but her dirt-covered hands. She was laughing at her own ineptitude, undeterred. Ashen returned to his report with newfound determination. If he was going to break protocol, he might as well be thorough about it. The mission culminated at the Cradle of Echoes, where standard regulations would have required reporting officer to maintain a safe distance from the destabilizing ritual. This officer made the calculated decision to disregard all 17 safety protocols in order to retrieve subject Rosehill from a self-sacrificial magical convergence. His hand moved across the page, filling sheet after sheet with technically accurate but increasingly personal observations. Where regulation required observed magical anomalies, he wrote, subject Celie Rosehill causes magic to behave erratically in her presence, possibly because magic itself seems to enjoy her company, not unlike this reporting officer. Hours passed. The sun shifted in the sky, painting the outpost in golden afternoon light. Ashen wrote until his hand cramped, until the events of the past weeks had been carefully documented in what was unquestionably the least regulation-compliant report of his career. 27 pages. Not a single omission of fact. Not a single adherence to emotional neutrality. He read it through once, feeling strangely light. Then, before he could reconsider, he affixed his ranger seal to the document. The magical mail system activated instantly. The report folded itself into a perfect square, rose from the desk in a swirl of magic, and disappeared in a puff of regulation blue smoke. Ashen sat back in his chair, waiting for the wave of regret. The anxiety. The concern for his career and reputation. They didn't come. Instead, he found himself smiling faintly as he imagined the Bureau officials' faces when they received his distinctly non-regulation account. Chief Ranger Thornhill would probably choke on her morning tea. His gaze drifted to the shelf where his enchanted clipboard rested. It had been inactive since the Cradle of Echoes, its notifications silenced by whatever magical disruption had occurred during the ritual. Now, unexpectedly, it chimed to life, glowing with fresh text scrolling across its surface. Report received, processing. A shadow fell across the doorway. Sely stood there, her face smudged with dirt, hair wild, looking somewhat concerned and entirely radiant. "Did you do it?" she asked, stepping into the outpost and eyeing the desk with its empty inkwell and scattered reference books. "Did you submit the career-ending report of feelings?" Before Ashen could answer, the clipboard dinged loudly, drawing both their attention. New text appeared. Report status, unprocessable. Citation, excessive emotional contamination of factual record. Cely's eyes widened. "Oh no! Are you in trouble?" Ashen wasn't certain. The clipboard had never rejected a report before. He'd never written one like this before, either. The clipboard dinged again, text appearing faster now. All violations coded as unquantifiable magical anomaly. Another ding. Subject Celie Rosehill, records expunged. And finally, Ranger Ward, extended leave authorized. Reassignment request denied. Then in smaller text at the bottom. Personal note from Chief Ranger, about damn time, Ward. Ashen blinked, not entirely certain he was reading the messages correctly. "Well?" Sely prompted, inching closer to the desk. "What does it mean? Are you fired? Am I arrested? Should we be running for the border? I know a guy with a questionably enchanted carpet." "They're giving me leave but not reassignment," Ashen translated, his voice caught between disbelief and something that might be relief. He looked up from the clipboard to Cely's face. She approached cautiously, her expression hopeful but uncertain. "Is that good?" For answer, Ashen stood and reached out, gently wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. His touch lingered, no longer constrained by regulation distances or professional boundaries. 3 weeks ago, I would have considered it a punishment, he admitted. Even now, the honesty felt strange on his tongue, like speaking a language he'd only recently begun to learn. Now I'm not certain what I want except... He stopped. The words weren't coming easily. Clinical observations, yes. Regulation citations, absolutely. But this raw truth about his own desires was still new territory. Sely didn't rush him. She simply waited, giving him space to find his way through the tangle of feelings that had no classification codes, no proper filing system. Except that it involves you, he finally managed. The simple truth of it was both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff and discovering you could fly. Cely's smile started slowly, then bloomed across her face with the brilliance of dawn. She opened her mouth to respond, but a crisp knock at the open door interrupted them. Bramble Quickwhistle stood there, somehow managing to look both impatient and precisely on time. Their enormous pack rose nearly twice their height, every compartment bulging with neatly labeled supplies. According to my calculations, you have approximately 3 minutes to decide if you're joining the expedition to the Shifting Isles, the halfling announced, adjusting their glasses with a businesslike gesture. Sely already agreed, and I've prepared color-coded snack rations for both of you. The blue ones are regulation-approved nutrient blocks. The pink ones taste like actual food. Ashen looked between Bramble's matter-of-fact expression and Cely's hopeful one. The halfway expectant, halfway disappointed look on her face suggested she fully expected him to decline. The Shifting Isles are notoriously unstable, he began in his ranger tone, falling back on facts in the face of such an abrupt decision. With unpredictable magical currents, and at least 17 documented reality distortions. Cely's expression dimmed slightly. Then after a pause he continued, I assume you have adequate maps? Bramble produced a roll of parchment with a flourish. Only the finest incomplete, possibly inaccurate cartography available. That's concerning, Ashen noted, but couldn't quite muster the appropriate level of disapproval. A month ago, the very idea of traveling to a magically unstable location with incomplete maps would have horrified him. Now it sounded almost appealing. The clipboard on the shelf gave one final chime. Ashen glanced over to read the message. Ranger status update, indefinite leave commencing. He looked at it for a long moment, then deliberately turned away. The bureau, the regulations, the perfectly ordered outpost, they would all be here when he returned. If he returned. Instead, he reached for Cely's hand, dirt and all, twining their fingers together in a gesture that felt more binding than any magical contract he'd ever signed. I believe, he said with newfound lightness, that I'm due for some chaos. Cely's brilliant smile was all the confirmation he needed that some rules were made to be broken, especially the ones he'd set for himself. As they followed Bramble out the door, Valor began singing again from its corner, this time a cheerful, if still off-key, ballad about new adventures and unexpected love. For once, Ashen didn't try to silence it.
The road ahead has glitter. Sunlight dappled the forest path as Sely adjusted her newly repaired backpack, now featuring unicorn hair stitching and enchanted pockets that somehow fit twice as much while weighing half as little. The morning air tasted like possibilities, crisp and sweet with a hint of magic. She took a deep breath, savoring the woodsy scent of adventure ahead. Behind her, Bramble meticulously arranged color-coded trail markers, while consulting 3 different compasses simultaneously. Sely couldn't help but smile at the halfling's thoroughness. Ever since Bramble had appointed herself their official expedition cartographer, not a single tree went unmarked, not a single landmark unnoted. It was adorably excessive. The Shifting Isles are approximately 47 miles southeast, Bramble announced, though with magical drift patterns they could be 48 miles due east by the time we arrive. The halfling paused to unwrap a perfectly rectangular nutrition bar, taking a precise bite before adding, or underwater. The probability calculations are inconclusive. Underwater works for me, Sely offered cheerfully. I've been meaning to test my new water-breathing charm anyway. Bramble's eyes widened with horror behind her thick glasses. Your what charm? Does it have bureau approval? Has it been tested? Please tell me you're not experimenting with respiratory magic without a Class 3 enchantment license. Relax, Sely laughed, wiggling her fingers in a deliberately mysterious gesture. It's just a little something I've been tinkering with. What's the worst that could happen? Drowning, Bramble practically shrieked. Magical fluid in the lungs. Sprouting gills in non-aquatic environments. Glitterhoof walked slightly ahead, silver hooves leaving faintly glowing prints that sparkled briefly before fading. The unicorn hadn't explicitly stated he was joining their expedition, but had simply continued walking with them, occasionally adjusting their course with a significant look or deliberate turn. His mane now featured several small braids adorned with protective charms, Cely's handiwork during their last evening at the ranger's outpost. Sely still couldn't believe he'd allowed her to do that. 2 weeks ago, he would have impaled her for attempting to touch his sacred mane. Progress. I expect we'll encounter at least 12 regulation violations before sundown, Ashen commented, his tone so dry that it took Celie a moment to realize he was joking. His ranger uniform had been replaced with more practical travel clothes, though he still wore the deep green that marked him as a ranger on leave. His steps were lighter now, less measured, as if he was allowing himself to wander rather than march. The change in him made her heart do little happy flips. She liked this version of Ashen, the one who hadn't consulted his rulebook since breakfast. Only 12? You're losing your touch, Ranger Ward, Cely teased, deliberately brushing her hand against his as they walked side by side. A small thrill ran through her when, instead of pulling away, he caught her fingers with his own. In response, the path beneath their feet briefly shimmered with tiny lights that danced up around their joined hands. Cely's magic had been doing that a lot lately, creating little displays of light whenever she touched Ashen. Not that she was complaining. If her magic wanted to throw a sparkle party every time they held hands, who was she to argue? The glitter is excessive, Glitterhoof projected into their minds, not bothering to turn around. Emotional displays shouldn't leave magical residue. It's untidy. Despite the complaint, the unicorn's tail swished in what Cely now recognized as contentment rather than irritation. From his saddlebag, which he adamantly refused to acknowledge as a unicorn fanny pack despite Cely's insistence, knitting needles clicked rhythmically. You're one to talk about excessive, Cely replied mentally. I found your glitter in my boots again this morning. And my tea. A natural unicorn byproduct. Completely different. You shed on purpose and we both know it. The unicorn snorted but didn't deny it. A familiar mechanical chime sounded from Ashen's pack. He sighed, reaching back to pull out his clipboard, which somehow managed to follow them despite being deliberately left behind. The device hovered in the air, its screen displaying notification, proximity spell status, voluntarily maintained. Then, almost smugly, relationship status update requested. Not this again, Ashen muttered, swiping ineffectually at the screen. Is it matchmaking us? Cely asked, staring at the clipboard in disbelief. Ashen looked equally perplexed as the device began displaying helpful relationship statistics. Compatible magical resonance, 94%. Argumentative chemistry, excellent. Predicted longevity, calculating. The clipboard spun in a pleased little circle. I think it likes us together, Cely whispered, fighting a grin. Bureau equipment shouldn't have preferences, Ashen replied, trying to sound stern but failing miserably when the corners of his mouth twitched upward. Suggested relationship milestone, cohabitation, the clipboard helpfully added. Cely burst out laughing. Is the Bureau trying to play magical matchmaker now? What's next, enchanted wedding invitations? The clipboard immediately displayed matrimonial documentation available upon request. Put that away, Ashen groaned, though Cely noticed he didn't look entirely displeased. Valor chose this moment to emerge partially from its scabbard on Ashen's back. If I may offer my humble observation, the sword began, its runes pulsing with excitement, in all the great ballads, this would be the moment for a dramatic declaration or perhaps a sweeping? Ashen gently pushed the sword back down, though his expression was more indulgent than annoyed. Everyone's a romantic critic, Cely observed, squeezing Ashen's hand. Even the weapons. Especially the weapons, Ashen corrected. Valor recited poetry for 3 hours straight last night. It was improving your emotional vocabulary, came the sword's muffled reply. I already have an extensive emotional vocabulary, Ashen protested. Sely raised an eyebrow. Last week you described yourself as not displeased when I asked if you were happy. That's accurate. It's bureaucratese for I'm over the moon but scared to admit it. His thumb traced a small circle on her palm. I'm working on it. The simple gesture sent warmth coursing through her. She'd never imagined Ashen Ward, bureau-approved grump extraordinaire, capable of such tenderness. Yet here he was, walking beside her, his guard down, his hand in hers, choosing her chaos over his carefully ordered world. Every time she thought about it, her magic tingled beneath her skin, ready to burst into fireworks. The path ahead split unexpectedly, one fork leading through a sun-dappled grove, the other descending into mist-shrouded woods. Neither appeared on Bramble's meticulously detailed maps. The halfling muttered something about cartographical impossibilities, while pulling out additional scrolls. Glitterhoof stopped, looking back at the group with ancient knowing eyes. Sely felt a familiar tug of curiosity toward the misty path. The unknown always called to her like a siren song, despite the many, many times it had gotten her into trouble. She glanced at Ashen, expecting to see his ranger instincts kicking in, ready to suggest the safer, sunnier route. Two paths, the unicorn observed silently to them all. The predictable, and the unknown. His galaxy eyes focused particularly on Sely and Ashen. Which will the Weaver and the Ranger choose? The question hung in the air, weighted with meaning beyond their immediate journey. The clipboard helpfully displayed Bureau-approved route left fork. Of course it would suggest the sunny path. Bureau-approved meant safe, predictable, documented. Everything the old Ashen would have chosen without hesitation. Sely looked up at Ashen, finding his storm-gray eyes already on her, warm with an emotion that still made her heart skip. Without hesitation, she tightened her grip on his hand and stepped decisively toward the misty path. Ashen moved with her, perfectly in sync. The unknown, he said, smiling that rare smile that transformed his entire face. Always with you. Behind them, the path erupted in a cascade of magical sparkles that traced their joined shadows as one. Sely's heart soared. He'd chosen the unpredictable path, chosen her way without hesitation. 2 months ago, he would have cited at least 14 regulations about unauthorized route deviations. Glitterhoof sighed dramatically but followed. If we encounter bog wraiths again, I'm not saving anyone, the unicorn projected, though Sely noted he was already glowing faintly, a sure sign he was preparing protective magic. Bramble frantically began a new map section labeled Unapproved Detour Number 1. This is how explorers get digested, the halfling muttered, but scurried after them nonetheless, already calculating coordinates. Valor hummed a romantic melody as the group disappeared into the mist. Sely felt lighter than she had in years, not because of any enchantment, but because of the hand holding hers, the friends surrounding her, the adventure ahead. For once her chaotic magic felt perfectly aligned with her heart, calm yet excited, centered yet free. As they ventured deeper into the mist, the forest changed around them. Luminous mushrooms sprouted from fallen logs, casting a gentle blue glow. Moths with translucent wings the size of dinner plates fluttered overhead, leaving trails of pollen that glittered before dissolving. The air felt charged, as if the very molecules were rearranging themselves. This isn't on any official bureau map, Ashen noted, his ranger training impossible to completely suppress. That's what makes it exciting, Sely replied. That's what makes it dangerous, Bramble corrected, frantically sketching the unfamiliar landscape, her 3 compasses now spinning in different directions. The mist grew thicker, curling around their ankles like affectionate cats. Sely felt it respond to her presence, swirling in little eddies when she passed. Her magic always did that, found the hidden enchantments in places and coaxed them out to play. The mist feels happy, she observed. Meteorological phenomena don't have emotions, Bramble objected. Tell that to the mist, Sely laughed as a tendril curled into a heart shape before dissolving. They came upon a small clearing, where the mist thinned enough to reveal a pool of water so still it resembled polished obsidian. Around its edges, flowers that shouldn't exist together bloomed in wild profusion. Winter frost lilies beside summer fire poppies, spring whisperthorns tangled with autumn dusk bells. Temporally unstable, Bramble whispered, adjusting her glasses. All 4 seasonal cycles occurring simultaneously. Fascinating and terrifying. Glitterhoof approached the pool, dipping his horn just above the surface. Ripples spread outward, though the horn hadn't actually touched the water. Time pool, the unicorn stated silently. Rarely seen these days. Sely knelt by the pool's edge, drawn by the swirling colors beneath its dark surface. What does it do? Shows possibilities, Glitterhoof answered. Past and future reflections. Is it safe? Ashen asked, kneeling beside her, one protective hand at the small of her back. Sely felt a rush of affection. Even with his new adventurous streak, he was still Ashen, still watching out for her, still concerned with her safety. The difference was that now he asked, instead of citing regulations that forbade it. Safe enough for the careful, Glitterhoof replied cryptically. Dangerous for the reckless. That narrows it down, Sely muttered. She leaned forward, her reflection shimmering strangely in the dark water. For a moment she saw herself as she had been weeks ago, wild-haired and desperate to prove herself, rushing headlong into the Briarwild glade to save a unicorn who didn't need saving. Then the image shifted, showing her surrounded by magical creatures, her hands weaving patterns of light while Ashen stood beside her, looking proud. Another ripple, and she glimpsed a cozy cottage with enchanted windows that changed views based on the occupants' moods. A final shift showed her and Ashen walking hand in hand through what looked like the Bureau's main hall, other rangers nodding respectfully. Possibilities, not promises. She looked up at Ashen, wondering if he saw the same things. His expression was soft with wonder, gray eyes reflecting the pool's magic. What do you see? She whispered. He blinked, returning to the present. Us, he said simply. Different versions, but always us. The warmth that flooded her had nothing to do with magic, and everything to do with the certainty in his voice. Bramble cleared her throat loudly from the edge of the clearing. Not to interrupt this extremely non-regulation romantic moment, the halfling said, but according to my calculations, we've entered a temporal fold. Time passes differently here. What feels like minutes could be hours outside. Or vice versa, Glitterhoof added, sounding bored but looking intently at something beyond the clearing. Sely reluctantly pulled her gaze from the pool. Should we move on? Probably wise, Ashen agreed, helping her to her feet. Besides, I'd rather live our future than just glimpse it. Her heart did another one of those little flips it had been doing so often lately. When had Stuffy Ranger Ward become such a romantic? She suspected Valor's poetry sessions were having more effect than he admitted. As they prepared to continue, Sely noticed something gleaming in the grass near the pool, a smooth stone that shifted colors like an opal but with deeper, more vibrant hues. She picked it up, feeling it warm instantly in her palm. What's this? She asked, showing it to Glitterhoof. The unicorn's ears flicked forward with interest. Memory stone, he projected. It absorbs significant moments. Useful for those who wish to revisit important memories without the imperfections of mortal recollection. Can I keep it? Sely asked, already enchanted by the way it pulsed gently in her hand, like a tiny heartbeat. Glitterhoof gave the unicorn equivalent of a shrug. It chose you. Seems it wants to record whatever chaotic adventures you drag us into next. Sely grinned, slipping the stone into one of her enchanted pockets. I'll take that as a compliment. They continued through the mist, which seemed to part more readily now, guiding rather than obscuring their path. The strange forest sang around them, branches creaking in harmony, unseen creatures chirping countermelody, even the moss seemed to hum when they passed. Where exactly are we? Bramble asked, frantically documenting everything. Between, Glitterhoof answered cryptically. Paths like these exist in the spaces left by mapmakers. That's not geographically possible, Bramble protested. Geography is more suggestion than law, Sely replied cheerfully, enjoying the halfling's frustrated expression. At least the fun kind is. Ashen chuckled beside her. That explains why you never stay on marked trails.
Exactly.
The best magic happens in the unmapped spaces. She squeezed his hand. Thank you for choosing the misty path. His expression softened as he looked down at her. I'm done choosing the safe route just because it's marked on a bureau map. Some things are worth the risk. The meaning behind his words was unmistakable. He wasn't just talking about forest paths. Even if it means facing glitter storms and temperamental unicorns, she teased, though her heart wasn't in the joke, it was too busy melting at his words. Even then. His thumb traced her knuckles. Though perhaps we could work on the glitter situation. Not negotiable, she replied, her magic responding with a small shower of sparkles that rained down around them. Valor partially emerged again, unable to remain silent. In the epic ballad, The Ranger's Surrender, the hero professes that he would brave 1,000 enchanted storms just to hold his beloved's hand through one. I find the parallel quite... Thank you, Valor, Ashen interrupted, though his eyes never left Celie's. The sword continued undeterred. I'm merely noting that emotional vulnerability has heroic precedent in the ancient texts and... Glitterhoof's silent voice cut through. The talking metal stick is correct. Nauseating, but correct. Now, can we proceed before I die of saccharine exposure? The unicorn trotted ahead, but not before Sely caught the slight upward tilt of his head, his version of approval rare as phoenix eggs and twice as precious. Leading them out of the mist, the path opened onto a view so spectacular it made Sely gasp. Below them stretched an impossibly green valley, where crystalline structures rose like towers from the forest floor. In the distance, islands floated in the sky, connected by bridges of light that formed and dissolved as needed. The shifting isles, Bramble whispered, awestruck. But how? We shouldn't have reached them for days. Different path, different rules, Sely said, unable to take her eyes off the breathtaking landscape. The clipboard, which had been mercifully quiet, chimed again. Destination reached, unorthodox method. Would you like to file a trajectory deviation report? No, Ashen and Sely said in unison, then laughed. As the group began their descent toward the valley, Sely felt the memory stone warm in her pocket, recording this moment. Not because it was some grand magical achievement or world-saving quest, but because it was theirs. A perfectly imperfect moment of adventure, friendship, and possibility. And really, what magic could be greater than that?
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.